long before cities, before borders, before memory itself learned to write things down. The world existed in a state that feels almost alien to us now. This was a planet held tightly in ice, locked into a long pause between breaths. Vast white sheets stretched across continents, pressing down on the land with a weight beyond human comprehension. Sea levels were lower by more than 100 meters, exposing enormous coastal plains where oceans exist today. Rivers carved paths across landscapes that no longer exist, flowing toward distant horizons instead of familiar shorelines. To stand in this world would be to feel an unsettling stillness, a sense that time itself had slowed, as if Earth were holding something back. The air was colder, sharper, drier. Winds swept unobstructed across tundra and steppe, carrying fine dust that settled into layers still visible in the geological record. Forests were limited, compressed into refuges where the climate allowed them to survive. Much of the planet was open land, grassy, treeless, and immense. Animals moved across these spaces in great migrations, following seasons that were harsher and more extreme than anything modern humans experience. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant bison, and other megafauna shaped the land with their movements, their presence as fundamental to these ecosystems as glaciers themselves. To modern eyes, this Ice Age world might appear frozen and static, but it was anything but dead. It was a system in balance, tense but functional, like a drawn bow held steady for thousands of years. Ice accumulated slowly, snowfall after snowfall compacting into glaciers that crept outward at speeds barely noticeable within a human lifetime. Oceans cooled and contracted. Carbon dioxide levels fell, reinforcing the cold. Everything was connected, each part reinforcing the other in a delicate equilibrium that had persisted for millennia. Humans were already part of this world, though not in the way we often imagine ourselves today. They did not dominate it. They endured within it. Small groups moved carefully across the land, reading subtle signs in animal behavior, weather patterns, and seasonal shifts. Survival depended on deep knowledge passed orally from one generation to the next. Where ice sheets blocked passage, humans adapted. Where deserts expanded under cold, dry air, they learned to move lightly across them. Their relationship with the environment was intimate and immediate. There was no illusion of control, only negotiation. From a distance, this era feels peaceful, even serene, but that calm is deceptive. Stability does not mean safety. Beneath the surface of this frozen world, enormous pressures were building. Ice sheets miles thick pressed down on the Earth's crust, depressing it under their weight. Entire regions were pushed lower, like memory foam under an unseen hand. Far from being rigid, the planet's surface flexed and adjusted, storing energy that would one day be released. Water, locked away as ice, waited silently above sea level, restrained only by temperature. The oceans themselves were transformed. With so much water trapped in ice, coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries. What are now shallow seas were once fertile plains, crossed by rivers and inhabited by plants, animals, and humans alike. These landscapes were not marginal. They were central to life at the time. They supported migration routes, seasonal camps, and ecological richness. To lose them would mean more than rising water. It would mean the erasure of entire worlds. Yet no one living then could have known what was coming. Climate change, when viewed from within a single lifetime, is nearly invisible. A slightly warmer summer, or longer thaw, glacier retreating just a little farther each generation. These changes did not arrive with thunder or warning. They arrived quietly, blending into the rhythm of seasonal variation. And that is what makes the moment before catastrophe so haunting. The world felt normal to those who lived in it. Familiar. Predictable enough to trust. This is the nature of thresholds. Systems can absorb stress for long periods without appearing to change at all. But balance does not mean permanence. Ice ages are not eternal states. They are chapters. And this chapter, though long, was nearing its end. The planet was beginning to shift in ways that would soon overwhelm the old equilibrium. Slight increases in solar radiation, subtle changes in Earth's orbit, and complex feedback loops within the climate system were nudging the world toward transformation. From our modern vantage point, it is tempting to see this moment as destiny, as if the floods to come were inevitable and clearly marked. But standing there, 11,600 years ago, nothing about the world would have felt apocalyptic. Glaciers still dominated the horizon, winters were still long and brutal. The ice still seemed endless. The idea that oceans could rise rapidly enough to reshape continents would have sounded impossible, even absurd, and yet, this is precisely what makes the story so powerful. The greatest changes in Earth's history often begin not with chaos, but with quiet. Before the roar of water, there is silence. Before landscapes are torn apart, they appear stable. The Ice Age world was not waiting in fear, it was waiting in ignorance, unaware that the forces sustaining it were already unraveling. This moment, the world before the waters, is more than a backdrop. It is the baseline against which all that follows must be measured. Without understanding the scale, stability, and apparent permanence of this frozen Earth, the catastrophe to come cannot be fully grasped. The floods did not simply add water to the world. They ended an age. They erased familiar geographies, forced migrations, and rewrote the relationship between humans and their environment. In the stillness of this Ice Age world lies the deepest irony of all. The planet looked unchanging, but it was already in motion. Ice was melting, not dramatically, not yet, but enough. Enough to begin a chain reaction that would accelerate beyond control. Enough to tip the balance of a system that had held firm for tens of thousands of years. Enough to remind us that stability is often just the calm before transformation. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the flood itself, but with the illusion that it could never happen. The grip of ice did not arrive suddenly, it crept into the world over thousands of years, tightening slowly, reshaping continents so gradually that no single generation could ever witness its full advance. Snow that failed to melt one summer became the foundation for glaciers the next. Layer upon layer compacted into ice, pressing outward and downward until entire regions were transformed into frozen plateaus that reflected sunlight back into the sky. What began as seasonal imbalance became a planetary condition. Cold reinforced cold, and the Earth settled into a new rhythm defined by restraint. At its peak, this frozen dominance covered much of the Northern Hemisphere. Ice sheets spread across North America and Eurasia, swallowing mountains, burying valleys, and flattening landscapes under kilometers of solid ice. These were not simple glaciers snaking through alpine passes, but continental ice masses so vast they altered wind patterns and redirected storms. The weight of them was immense, heavy enough to depress the crust beneath, bending the Earth itself into shallow basins. In these regions, the land sank under pressure, storing a geological memory that would only be released once the ice disappeared. Beyond the ice sheets lay a world shaped by their influence. Cold, dry air spilled outward from the frozen cores, creating vast belts of steppe and tundra. Forests retreated southward or clung to sheltered refuges where moisture and warmth still lingered. Deserts expanded not because of heat, but because of cold that stripped the air of water. Dust storms became common, carrying fine sediments across continents and depositing them in thick layers that still mark the land today. Even places far from the ice felt its presence, their climates tuned to distant frozen giants. Oceans responded as well. As water was locked away on land, sea levels fell dramatically, exposing continental shelves that had been submerged for millions of years. Entire new lands emerged, broad plains, stretching hundreds of kilometers beyond modern coastlines. Rivers carved deep channels across these exposed seabeds, winding toward a horizon that no longer exists. These regions became biological crossroads, linking continents and allowing plants, animals, and humans to move between worlds that are now separated by water. The map of Earth was fundamentally different, its coastlines temporary, its seas restrained. Life adapted to this long cold with remarkable resilience. Animals evolved thicker fur, broader bodies, and slower metabolisms to conserve heat. Some migrated vast distances to follow shifting resources, while others specialized in surviving extreme scarcity. The presence of massive herbivores shaped vegetation patterns, maintaining open landscapes through constant grazing. Predators followed in their wake, and humans, newly arrived in many regions, learned to do the same. Survival was not about dominance, but timing, knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to risk everything. For humans, the Ice Age was a teacher both cruel and precise. Every mistake carried immediate consequences. Hunger, exposure, and misjudged seasons could mean extinction for an entire group. Yet this pressure forged deep intelligence. Humans learned to read the land with extraordinary sensitivity. A shift in wind direction, a change in animal behavior, the thickness of river ice. These were signals as meaningful as language. Knowledge became the most valuable resource, stored not in objects, but in memory and story. Despite its harshness, the Ice Age was not a time of constant suffering. There were moments of abundance, brief summers when plants flourished and animals gathered in great numbers. These windows of plenty allowed cultures to develop, art to emerge, and social bonds to deepen. But everything existed within limits imposed by the cold. Growth was temporary. Excess was dangerous. Stability depended on respect for forces far beyond human influence. What made this frozen world feel eternal was its duration. Thousands of years passed with the same fundamental conditions. Generations were born, lived, and died under the same sky, beside the same glaciers, walking across the same exposed plains. Memory extended back only so far, and within that memory, the ice had always been there. It shaped identity, belief, and expectation. To imagine a world without it would have been almost impossible. And yet, the Ice Age was never a static state. Even at its coldest, it fluctuated. Glaciers advanced and retreated in pulses, responding to subtle shifts in temperature and precipitation. These movements were slow but relentless, reminders that the system was alive, dynamic, and sensitive. A few degrees of warming could change snowfall into rain. A slightly longer summer could thin an ice margin. These small variations mattered, even if their consequences took centuries to unfold. The power of ice lies not just in its mass, but in its patience. It accumulates quietly, reshapes landscapes without noise, and erases features that took millions of years to form. Mountains are ground down, valleys are widened, and bedrock is polished smooth. When the ice moves, it carries entire ecosystems with it, relocating soils, seeds, and stones across vast distances. Long after it melts, its signature remains etched into the land. As the Ice Age persisted, the planet became finely tuned to its presence. Atmospheric circulation adapted to the cold poles. Ocean currents adjusted to altered salinity and temperature. Ecosystems found new equilibria. This integration is what made the coming change so dangerous. The world was not merely cold, it was dependent on the cold. Remove the ice, and everything connected to it will be forced to respond. But from within the Ice Age, none of this felt precarious. The slow pace of change masked the fragility of the system. Stability bred trust, trust bred assumption. The ice had always been there, so it would always remain. This belief was not ignorance, but a natural response to deep time experience through short lives. The long grip of ice shaped not only landscapes and climates, but the psychology of survival. It taught endurance, caution, and respect for limits. It also set the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history, because when a system has been held in balance for so long, the forces required to undo it are immense, and once released, they do not act gently. The Ice Age was not merely a prelude, it was a world in its own right, complete and coherent, governed by rules that made sense within its frozen logic. To understand what was lost when the waters rose, one must first understand what existed before them. A planet disciplined by cold, shaped by ice, and convinced through long familiarity that this was the way the world was meant to be. At the edge of this frozen world lived humans who had no concept of being prehistoric, no awareness that they would one day be studied as echoes of deep time. To them, Life was immediate, grounded in the present moment, shaped by hunger, weather, and movement. Survival was not an abstract challenge, but a daily negotiation with the land. Each decision, where to travel, when to hunt, how long to stay, carried weight far beyond individual comfort. The stakes could mean death, not just for one person, but for an entire group. These humans lived lightly on the land, not out of philosophy, but necessity. Resources were unpredictable, scattered across vast territories shaped by ice and cold winds. Food did not grow in fields or wait behind walls. It moved, migrated, disappeared, and returned according to rhythms that demanded patience and attentiveness. To follow these rhythms required an intimate understanding of animals and seasons. Hunters learned the habits of prey so well that they could anticipate movement weeks in advance. They knew when herds would arrive, when rivers would freeze solid enough to cross, and when storms would make travel impossible. Family and community were not social choices, they were survival strategies. Alone, a human stood little chance against cold, predators, or injury. Together, knowledge could be pooled, labor divided, and risk shared. Elders carried memories of past winters and failed hunts. Children absorbed skills through observation long before they could contribute. Stories were not entertainment, but instruction, maps encoded in language, warnings disguised as myth. Lessons passed forward in ways that could be remembered under stress. The Ice Age demanded constant mobility. Groups followed animals across steppe and tundra, shifting camps as seasons changed. Shelters were temporary, constructed quickly from hides, bone, wood, and stone. Nothing was built to last forever, because permanence was a liability in a world that could change without warning. Even so, these people were not rootless. They returned to the same places again and again: river crossings, sheltered valleys, reliable hunting grounds, building a mental geography as precise as any modern map. Cold shaped every aspect of existence. Clothing was not fashion, but technology, carefully designed to trap heat while allowing movement. Fire was more than warmth. It was protection, cooking, light, and social center. Around flames, people gathered, repaired tools, shared food, and reinforced bonds that made cooperation possible. In the darkness of long winters, fire marked the boundary between human life and the indifferent cold beyond. Despite the hardships, this was not a life devoid of meaning or creativity. Even under constant pressure, humans found ways to express identity and belief. Art appeared in the form of carvings, pigments, and carefully shaped tools. These were not luxuries, but reflections of how people understood themselves within the world. Symbols connected them to animals, seasons, and forces they could not control. Spirituality, in whatever form it took, was deeply tied to nature, not as something to be conquered, but something to be understood and respected. The edge of survival sharpened perception. A change in wind direction was not trivial. It could signal an approaching storm or a shift in animal movement. The thickness of ice on a river determined whether a crossing was safe or fatal. Clouds, stars, and the behavior of birds all carried meaning. This constant attention created a form of intelligence that modern humans rarely experience, one rooted not in abstraction, but in immediate consequence. Yet even in this finely tuned existence, vulnerability was ever present. Illness, injury, or a run of bad luck could push a group beyond its limits. There were no stored surpluses to rely on, no distant allies to call for help. Survival depended on flexibility and the ability to move on when conditions worsened. Abandoning a familiar place was painful, but often necessary. Attachment had to be balanced against pragmatism. Children grew up quickly in this world, learning responsibility through participation rather than instruction. From an early age, they observed hunts, helped gather food, and learned to recognize danger. Play itself was preparation, mimicking adult roles and rehearsing skills needed later. Knowledge was not taught in isolation. It was woven into daily life, reinforced by repetition and necessity. For these humans, the land was not scenery. It was a living presence. Hills, Rivers and animal paths carried memory and meaning. Certain places were remembered for abundance, others for tragedy. The environment was not static, but relational, shaped by past experiences and future expectations. This deep connection created a sense of belonging that went beyond territory. It was an understanding that survival was possible only through alignment with the world as it was, not as one wished it to be. The edge they lived on was not just physical, but temporal. These humans occupied a narrow window between stability and collapse, though they could not see it. The Ice Age had provided a consistent framework for life, harsh but familiar. Within that framework, cultures adapted, thrived, and passed on knowledge refined over countless generations. But this stability was fragile, dependent on climate patterns already beginning to shift. What makes their stories so compelling is not just how they survived, but how little warning they had of what was coming. No sign marked the end of an age. No signal announced that the rules were about to change. The same glaciers that defined their horizons, the same plains they crossed year after year, would soon begin to vanish. Rivers would swell beyond memory, coastlines would move, entire landscapes would disappear beneath water. These humans did not know they were living at the edge of survival in a historical sense. They only knew they were living. They adapted as they always had, responding to immediate challenges with inherited wisdom and careful observation. And for a time, that was enough. But the forces gathering beyond their perception were larger than any adaptation could fully absorb. Their lives remind us that humanity has always existed within limits imposed by nature. Control is a modern illusion. For most of our history, survival depended on humility, on recognizing that the world could change faster than we could. As the Ice Age world approached its breaking point, these early humans stood not as masters of their environment, but as participants in a system far greater than themselves. They were resilient, intelligent, and deeply connected to their world. Yet even these strengths would soon be tested by changes unlike anything they had experienced before. The edge of survival was about to shift, not gradually, but suddenly, and the world they knew would never be the same again. For most of its frozen reign, the Ice Age felt stable, even dependable in its harshness. Seasons followed patterns that, while unforgiving, were at least familiar. Winters were long and brutal, summers short and restrained. Ice advanced and retreated at the margins, but the overall balance held. Yet beneath this apparent consistency, the planet was slowly drifting away from equilibrium. Change was subtle enough to escape notice, but powerful enough to reshape the world. The first signs did not arrive as disasters. They came as mild deviation summers that lingered a little longer, winters that loosened their grip just slightly. Snow that once remained year-round began to melt at lower elevations. Glaciers still dominated the landscape, but their edges thinned and softened. Meltwater trickled where none had flowed before, feeding streams that ran longer each year. These were not dramatic events. They were quiet adjustments, easy to dismiss as natural variation. What was driving this shift lay far beyond human perception. Earth's orbit and axial tilt, moving through slow and predictable cycles, altered how sunlight reached the planet. Small increases in summer solar radiation in the Northern Hemisphere tipped the balance just enough to favor melting over accumulation. Ice that had grown for tens of thousands of years began to lose ground, not because of a sudden surge in heat, but because the delicate accounting of snowfall versus melt had changed. As ice retreated, it revealed darker land beneath soil, rock, vegetation. Unlike bright ice, these surfaces absorbed sunlight rather than reflecting it back into space. This absorption warmed the ground further, accelerating melting in a powerful feedback loop. What began as a minor adjustment became a self-reinforcing process. The planet was no longer just warming. It was amplifying its own change. The atmosphere responded in turn. As temperatures rose even slightly, warmer air held more moisture. Precipitation patterns shifted. Some regions became wetter, others drier. Storm tracks moved, winds changed direction and intensity. These alterations disrupted ecosystems finely tuned to Ice Age conditions. Plants, adapted to cold, struggled as seasons grew unpredictable. Animals found migration routes altered by swelling rivers and unstable terrain. The oceans, long constrained by the cold, also began to change. Meltwater flowed into the seas, freshening surface layers and altering currents that distributed heat around the globe. These currents, crucial to climate stability, weakened or shifted, sending ripples of change across distant regions. Warming in one part of the world could trigger cooling or drying in another. The system was interconnected, sensitive, and increasingly unstable. What made this imbalance so dangerous was its invisibility on human timescales. A single lifetime might notice a river running higher or a glacier edge retreating a short distance. But these observations lacked context. Change was incremental, blending into memory rather than standing out as something new. Elders could recall colder winters, but variation was part of life. There was no clear line marking the transition from stability to instability. Meanwhile, the sheer mass of ice still present masked the scale of what was unfolding. Continental ice sheets kilometers thick do not vanish quickly, even under sustained warming. Their presence reassured the senses. As long as the ice remained, the world felt secure. But size can be deceptive. Once melting reaches a critical threshold, the response accelerates rapidly. Ice thins, fractures and destabilizes, becoming vulnerable to forces that once held little influence. Underneath the ice, pressure was being released. As glaciers lost mass, the land beneath began a slow rebound, rising upward after being depressed for millennia. This movement altered drainage patterns, redirecting meltwater in unexpected ways. Rivers carved new channels. Lakes formed where none had existed before. Water collected behind natural dams of ice and sediment, storing immense volumes in precarious balance. The ecosystems that had adapted to cold now faced a dilemma: move, adapt, or disappear. Species followed retreating climates northward or to higher elevations. Others could not migrate fast enough. Extinctions began to ripple through food webs, destabilizing relationships built over thousands of years. Humans, dependent on these systems, felt the effects indirectly, shifting animal populations, unfamiliar vegetation, altered hunting grounds. Despite these pressures, the world still did not feel catastrophic. Change remained fragmented, experienced differently in different regions. One valley might grow greener, another drier. A river might become more reliable, another more dangerous. The absence of a single, overwhelming event allowed the illusion of control to persist. Adaptation seemed possible. Adjustment felt sufficient. Yet the system as a whole was drifting farther from balance. Ice melt increased year after year. Meltwater pooled behind ice barriers that were never meant to hold such volume. Sea levels rose slowly at first, then faster, as more ice contributed to the oceans. Coastal plains, once stable and productive, began to flood seasonally. Saltwater crept inland, altering soils and ecosystems long before land was fully submerged. The danger of imbalance lies not in the initial change, but in what follows. Systems built for one state struggle to operate in another. Thresholds are crossed quietly, but their consequences arrive suddenly. An ice dam holds until it does not. Glacier remains intact until internal fractures reach a critical point. Climate pattern persists until feedbacks overwhelm stability. This was the moment the planet entered, no longer frozen in equilibrium, not yet plunged into chaos, but hovering in between. A world out of balance does not announce itself. It continues to function, even as stresses accumulate. From within it, life feels normal enough to continue. From outside, with the benefit of hindsight, the warning signs are unmistakable. The tragedy of this transition is not that it happened, but that it was unavoidable once set in motion. The forces driving it operated on scales far larger than human action. Choice, no ritual, no migration could halt the warming sun or restore the precise conditions that had maintained the ice age. The system was shifting, and everything within it would have to respond. This imbalance was not malicious. Nature does not intend catastrophe. It follows physical laws, responding to energy and matter with indifferent precision. But indifference does not mean gentleness. When balance is lost, the adjustments required to restore it can be violent. The world was changing, not in isolated moments, but as an integrated whole. Ice, air, water, land, and life were all reacting to the same underlying forces. Each response fed into the next, accelerating the process. What began as subtle warming was becoming transformation. Standing at this threshold, the Ice Age world was already fading, even if it did not yet know it. The familiar rhythms that had guided life for millennia were breaking down. The balance that had made survival possible was slipping away, and soon, the consequences of this imbalance would no longer be quiet. Water, long held back by ice, would begin to move with unstoppable force, reshaping the planet in ways that no living being could ignore. For thousands of years, the greatest force shaping the planet had been silence. Snow fell, compacted, and became ice without drama. Glaciers advanced not with violence, but with persistence, inching forward year after year, pressing themselves into the land. Over time, this quiet accumulation produced something extraordinary, a hidden weight so immense that it bent the earth beneath it. Entire regions were pushed downward under the massive ice sheets that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Mountains disappeared. Valleys flattened. The land itself adjusted, yielding slowly to pressure it could not resist. This weight was not evenly distributed. In the Northern Hemisphere, ice piled thickest over what are now Canada, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. In some places, ice reached heights comparable to modern skyscrapers stacked one upon another. The pressure exerted by such mass was beyond anything humans could experience directly. Bedrock cracked. The crust sank. The mantle below flowed subtly, accommodating the load like a thick, slow-moving fluid. This process, invisible on the surface, stored energy in the planet's structure, a tension waiting for release. But the weight of ice was not only geological. It was hydrological. Trapped within these frozen sheets was an astonishing volume of water, enough to lower global sea levels by more than 100 meters. Oceans were missing a vast portion of their mass, held aloft on land as solid ice. This imbalance transformed coastlines, currents, and climates, yet it also meant that the potential for change was enormous. All of that water still belonged to the oceans. It was only temporarily restrained. As warming began, this hidden weight started to shift. Ice did not simply vanish. It thinned, fractured, and destabilized. Meltwater formed on the surface of glaciers, seeping downward through cracks and crevasses. This water lubricated the base of the ice, allowing it to slide more easily over the ground beneath. Movement accelerated. Glaciers that had once crept forward at glacial speed began to flow faster, redistributing their mass in unpredictable ways. In low-lying areas, meltwater collected into vast lakes, trapped behind natural dams of ice and sediment. These lakes grew silently, expanding year after year as more ice melted. From the surface, they appeared stable, serene even. But their stability was an illusion. Ice dams are inherently fragile. They hold not because they are strong, but because they are cold. As temperatures rose, the integrity of these frozen barriers weakened. Pressure increased, cracks formed. The water pressed outward, always seeking release. The sheer volume involved defies modern intuition. Some of these glacial lakes held more water than all the world's rivers combined. They represented stored energy on a planetary scale. Gravity pulled relentlessly on this mass, while the thinning ice struggled to contain it. A single failure point, a fracture, a collapse, a sudden surge of meltwater could trigger a chain reaction with catastrophic consequences. At the same time, the land beneath the ice began to respond to the changing load. As ice melted and weight lifted, the crust started to rebound upward in a process known today as isostatic adjustment. This rebound was slow but powerful, altered the slope of the land, changing how water flowed across it. Rivers that once drained in one direction were redirected, basins deepened or shallowed. Meltwater found new paths, sometimes toward the sea, sometimes into enclosed depressions where it accumulated dangerously. These interacting forces Melting ice, shifting land, rising water created a world primed for sudden release. The system was no longer defined by accumulation, but by instability. Ice sheets, once anchors of climate, became liabilities. Their mass, which had shaped the world through patience, now threatened to reshape it through collapse. For humans living near these ice margins, the danger was largely invisible. The lake might grow larger each season, but without context, its scale was difficult to grasp. A glacier might retreat, but its remaining bulk still seemed eternal. The idea that an entire landscape could be obliterated by water released in a matter of days lay far beyond experience. Survival strategies owned over generations were based on gradual change, not sudden catastrophe. What made this moment so perilous was the interaction of slow and fast processes. The buildup of ice had taken tens of thousands of years. Its release would occur in bursts lasting weeks, days, or even hours. Energy stored over millennia would be unleashed almost instantaneously. The planet was shifting from a mode of restraint to one of release, and nothing in the living memory of any species could prepare them for it. The hidden weight of ice also masked the fragility of the system. From a distance, ice sheets appeared solid, immovable, but thickness does not guarantee stability. As melting progressed, internal stresses increased. Crevasses deepened, ice shelves fractured. Structural integrity weakened from within. Collapse did not require the disappearance of all ice, only the failure of key supports. This vulnerability extended beyond individual ice sheets. The entire climate system had become dependent on the presence of ice. Its reflective surface helped regulate temperature. Its mass-shaped wind patterns, its meltwater influenced ocean circulation. As the ice weakened, these stabilizing influences diminished, accelerating change across the globe. There is a profound irony in this hidden weight. Ice that had made the Ice Age possible was the same ice that would end it. Its accumulation created stability, but its sheer mass guaranteed that once melting began, the consequences would be enormous. Balance, when maintained by extreme conditions, is inherently unstable. In this moment, the planet stood on the edge of release. Water waited behind ice barriers, land adjusted beneath shifting loads. Climate systems strained under changing conditions. All the ingredients for catastrophe were in place. Even if the final trigger had not yet been pulled, the story of what comes next is not one of gradual adaptation, but of sudden transformation. When the hidden weight of ice finally gave way, the result would not be a gentle flooding or a slow rise of seas. It would be a violent reordering of landscapes, driven by forces that had been quietly building since the first snow of the Ice Age fell. The frozen world did not collapse all at once. Before the great releases of water, before landscapes were torn open, there were signs. Small, fragmented, easy to overlook. These were the first cracks in a system that had held for tens of thousands of years. Ice, once thick and unified, began to fracture under its own weight. The margins of glaciers softened, their edges losing the sharp clarity that had defined them for generations. What had once been solid and continuous became riddled with weaknesses. Surface melt became more common as summers lengthened. Pools of water formed atop the ice, glistening under sunlight that would once have been reflected away. These pools were more than surface features. Water is heavy, and it exerts pressure. As meltwater accumulated, it forced its way downward through cracks, drilling vertical shafts through the ice. These channels allowed water to reach the glacier's base, lubricating the boundary between ice and land. The result was subtle but profound. Glaciers began to move faster, slipping rather than creeping. This acceleration destabilized ice fronts and dams that had been stable for centuries. Ice is strongest when cold and immobile. Once it begins to flow, internal stresses increase. Cracks widen. Sections thin unevenly. Structural integrity weakens. Ice barriers holding back vast lakes were never engineered to withstand these new conditions. They were temporary by nature, dependent on cold rather than strength. Meltwater found every weakness, flowed along the base of ice sheets, carving channels unseen from the surface. It pooled in low points, increasing pressure on already stressed structures. In some places, ice dams bulged outward, visibly strained by the weight they contained. In others, collapse began internally as water melted ice from below, hollowing it out like rot inside a tree. Beyond the ice itself, the surrounding landscape began to change. Rivers swelled with meltwater, flowing longer into the year and cutting deeper into their banks. Seasonal floods became more intense, depositing sediments in unfamiliar patterns. Low-lying areas turned into wetlands or shallow lakes. The land, once locked in predictable rhythms, became increasingly volatile. For ecosystems adapted to stability, these changes were disruptive. Animals that relied on frozen ground found migration routes blocked by mud and open water. Plants adapted to cold, dry conditions struggled in wetter soils. Insects and smaller organisms responded quickly, shifting populations in ways that cascaded through food webs. Humans, dependent on these systems, faced growing uncertainty. Familiar hunting grounds changed. Travel routes became dangerous or impassable. Yet, even as these disruptions multiplied, the world did not yet feel like it was ending. Change remained local, experienced unevenly across regions. One valley might flood while another dried out. One glacier might retreat rapidly while another seemed unchanged. This patchwork of transformation made it difficult to perceive the broader pattern. Life continued, adaptation continued. The illusion of control persisted. What made this stage so critical was the way it primed the system for catastrophe. Ice dams weakened incrementally, each melt season eroding their strength. Glacial lakes grew larger, storing more water and increasing the pressure on their barriers. Rivers carved deeper channels, making landscapes more vulnerable to sudden inundation. The planet was quietly preparing itself for failure. There is a moment in any system under stress when resilience gives way to fragility. Before that point, disturbances are absorbed and corrected. After it, disturbances amplify and spread. The Ice Age world was crossing that threshold. The mechanisms that once stabilized it, cold temperatures, slow movement, thick ice, were being undermined simultaneously. The most dangerous aspect of this transition was timing. The forces weakening the ice were slow and seasonal, but the consequences of failure would be sudden. Ice dam might hold for decades, even centuries, before collapsing in a single moment. Glacier might appear stable until a critical fracture propagated through its interior. The delay between cause and effect obscured the risk. For humans and animals alike, there was little opportunity to anticipate what was coming. Warning signs were ambiguous. A larger lake might suggest abundance rather than danger. Increased meltwater might improve access to fresh water and plant growth. Short-term benefits masked long-term risks. By the time those risks became undeniable, escape might no longer be possible. As ice thinned, the landscape beneath was exposed to forces it had not felt in thousands of years. Soil long protected by ice was suddenly vulnerable to erosion. Slopes collapsed. Sediments washed into rivers, further altering their behavior. The removal of ice also removed a stabilizing weight, allowing the land to shift and tilt, changing drainage patterns in ways that compounded instability. This was a world in transition, neither fully frozen nor fully transformed. It was defined by uncertainty, by the breakdown of familiar patterns without the establishment of new ones. The old rules still applied often enough to feel reliable, but failed often enough to inspire anxiety. Survival became more complex, requiring constant reassessment of risks that had once been predictable. The first cracks in the frozen world were not loud. They did not announce themselves with cataclysmic noise or dramatic upheaval. They were subtle, cumulative, and easily rationalized. But they marked a fundamental shift in the planet's behavior. The Ice Age was no longer a stable condition. It was becoming a transient phase, moving inexorably toward collapse. These cracks were more than physical fractures in ice. They were breaks in a long-standing relationship between climate and life. The systems that had allowed humans Animals and ecosystems to coexist within narrow margins were unraveling. Adaptation would still matter, but it would no longer be enough on its own. The world was entering a new phase, one defined not by accumulation, but by release. The frozen reservoirs of water that had shaped the planet for tens of thousands of years were losing their grip. The stage was set for events that would unfold with terrifying speed, reshaping continents and rewriting the story of life on Earth. When the failure finally came, it did not arrive as a gradual spilling of water or a gentle overflow. It arrived with suddenness so complete that it erased the boundary between before and after. Ice dam that had held back unimaginable pressure for centuries gave way in a matter of moments. Cracks that had slowly widened snapped open. Walls of ice collapsed inward. And then gravity took control. The water did not flow, it exploded outward. Entire lakes, built over generations of melting, were released almost instantly. A surge of water poured downhill with a force no river had ever carried. The ground trembled as the flood accelerated, stripping soil from bedrock, uprooting vegetation, and tearing apart everything in its path. What had once been a stable landscape was transformed into a corridor of destruction within hours. The scale of these floods defies modern experience. The volume of water released in a single event could rival all the rivers on Earth combined. Water levels rose tens of meters in moments. Flow speeds reached unimaginable levels, carrying boulders the size of houses as if they were pebbles. Entire hillsides collapsed under the pressure, their material swept downstream and redeposited miles away. Channels were carved into the land with brutal efficiency. Valleys were widened, deepened, and in some cases completely erased. Where rivers had once meandered slowly, new paths were gouged straight through bedrock. The force of the water scoured the ground clean, leaving behind vast expanses of bare stone marked by ripples and grooves, signatures of a flow far beyond anything seen today. Nothing living in the path of these floods could resist them. Animals were caught without warning, swept away in torrents that offered no refuge. Vegetation was stripped from the soil, forests flattened or torn out by the roots. For humans, survival depended entirely on location and chance. Those in high ground or distant valleys might never witness the flood directly, learning of it only through altered landscapes and disrupted ecosystems. Those in its path had no time to react. Sound would have preceded the water, a distant, growing roar, unlike any storm or avalanche. Then the horizon itself would have moved, replaced by a wall of churning, debris-filled water. There were no signals, no gradual rise, no opportunity to flee once it was visible. The flood did not negotiate, it erased. These events did not occur just once. As the climate continued to warm, multiple ice dams failed across different regions. Each release added to the chaos, reshaping landscapes repeatedly. Some areas were flooded again and again, compounding the damage and carving features so large that they still dominate the terrain today. In the aftermath, the land bore scars that spoke of unimaginable violence. Massive boulders lay scattered far from any plausible source. Dry channels wider than modern rivers cut through plateaus. Deposits of sediment formed in chaotic layers, evidence of water moving with extreme speed and power. These were not the marks of slow erosion. They were the fingerprints of catastrophe. For ecosystems, recovery was uneven. In some places, the floods deposited fertile sediments that would later support rich growth. In others, the land was stripped to bedrock, requiring centuries or millennia to recover. Species distributions shifted dramatically as habitats were destroyed and recreated. Survival favored those capable of rapid adaptation or migration. Human groups faced a transformed world. Familiar landmarks vanished. Hunting grounds were destroyed or altered beyond recognition. River systems that once guided movement became barriers or threats. Knowledge passed down through generations suddenly lost relevance. The land no longer behaved as it had before. The psychological impact of such events is difficult to overstate. For survivors, the floods would have been incomprehensible. There was no framework to explain destruction on this scale. Stories and myths may have begun here, attempts to give meaning to forces that seem supernatural in their power. Water became not just a resource, but a symbol of chaos, renewal, and fear. What makes these floods especially significant is not just their violence, but their speed. Geological change is often imagined as slow and gradual, unfolding over millions of years. These events shattered that assumption. Entire regions were reshaped in days or weeks. The planet demonstrated an ability to change almost instantly when thresholds were crossed. The release of these waters also accelerated other changes. Floods carried enormous amounts of sediment into oceans, affecting marine ecosystems and coastal stability. Freshwater surges altered ocean salinity, influencing currents and climate patterns far beyond the flood zones themselves. The consequences rippled outward, affecting regions that never experienced the floods directly. In the broader narrative of Earth's history, these events mark a turning point. They represent the moment when the Ice Age's long restraint gave way to sudden release. The water that had been locked away for tens of thousands of years returned to the oceans in violent pulses, driving rapid sea level rise and reshaping coastlines around the world. The land remembers these floods even when memory fades. Their traces are etched into stone, visible from the air, unmistakable to those who know how to read them. They stand as evidence that the planet is capable of acts of transformation that defy human expectation. For those who lived through them, there was no lesson, no warning, only survival or extinction. The floods did not discriminate. They did not pause. They did not adapt. They were the inevitable release of stored energy, following physical laws with absolute indifference to life. This was the moment when the world crossed a point of no return. The Ice Age could not be restored. The landscapes it had created were gone, replaced by something new and unstable. The waters had broken free. And in doing so, they reshaped the future of the planet, leaving behind a world that would never again be the same. After the waters withdrew, what remained was not a return to normal, but a landscape permanently altered, bearing wounds so vast they could not be mistaken for the work of ordinary rivers. The floods had moved with a scale and violence that exceeded the logic of familiar geography. Where water once followed gentle curves and predictable paths, it had instead torn straight through the land, ignoring contours, defying slopes, and overwhelming every natural boundary. The earth itself appeared to have been ripped open. Vast channels lay dry beneath open skies, many of them far larger than any river that flowed through them afterward. Some were dozens of kilometers wide, carved directly into bedrock, their walls steep and raw. These were not valleys shaped by time, but scars formed almost instantly. The ground was scoured clean, stripped of soil and vegetation, leaving behind exposed stone marked by giant ripples frozen in place. These ripples, sometimes taller than a person, spoke of currents moving with unimaginable force. Boulders lay scattered across plains where no mountains stood nearby. Some were as large as houses, transported kilometers from their origin by water powerful enough to lift and carry them. Their presence made no sense within the framework of normal erosion. Only floods of extraordinary magnitude could explain such displacement. The land itself testified to the truth, long before science would learn to read it. In places, the floods had split the earth into isolated islands of rock, leaving behind mesas and plateaus surrounded by deep channels. These features stood like remnants of a former world, untouched only because the water had flowed around them rather than over them. From above, the terrain resembled a shattered surface, as if the planet's skin had cracked under pressure. Where the water slowed, it dropped its load. Thick layers of sediment were deposited chaotically, mixed with stones of all sizes, stacked without the orderly sorting typical of river deposits. These layers recorded moments of extreme turbulence, when flow speeds changed rapidly and water dumped everything it carried in sudden bursts. The ground became a layered archive of catastrophe, preserving the sequence of destruction. Some channels led nowhere. They ended abruptly, cutting off at cliffs or empty basins, evidence of water that surged across the land without following a long-term drainage system. These ghost rivers existed only for the duration of the flood, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as fast. Their purpose was singular: to carry unimaginable volumes of water away as quickly as possible. For ecosystems, the aftermath was a landscape of extremes. Some regions were left barren, stripped down to rock, inhospitable to life for generations. Others became unexpectedly fertile, covered in fresh sediments rich in nutrients. Plants colonized these areas rapidly, taking advantage of newly exposed soils and abundant water. Life returned, but it returned unevenly, reshaping ecological patterns in ways that would echo for millennia. Animals adapted by necessity. Species retreated from flood-scarred regions entirely, while others exploited new habitats created by the chaos. Wetlands formed in depressions left behind by receding waters, attracting birds and aquatic life. Rivers established new courses, sometimes occupying flood-carved channels, sometimes abandoning them altogether. The natural order reorganized itself around a geography born of violence. Humans faced a transformed world that demanded new understanding. Familiar routes were gone, replaced by obstacles that could not be crossed easily. Rivers that once guided travel now threatened it. Knowledge passed down through generations no longer aligned with the land as it existed. Survival required rapid learning, experimentation, and adaptation to features that had no precedent. To those who came later, these landscapes would appear ancient, as if they had always been this way. Without context, the sheer scale of the channels might be attributed to slow erosion over immense time. But the truth was far more unsettling. These were landscapes created almost instantaneously, reminders that the earth can change faster than memory. What makes these scars so haunting is their permanence. Even as ecosystems recovered and climates stabilized, the channels remained. They were too large to be erased by normal processes. Wind and rain softened their edges. Vegetation crept back in places, but the fundamental shape endured. They became silent witnesses to events no living being could fully comprehend. In some regions, later rivers followed these flood-carved paths, flowing through channels vastly oversized for their modest volumes. These rivers appeared misplaced, dwarfed by the spaces they occupied. Their presence hinted at a past far more violent than their gentle currents suggested. The land held secrets that only careful observation could reveal. The existence of such features challenges comfortable assumptions about Earth's history. It forces a recognition that gradual change is not the only mechanism shaping the planet. Catastrophe, rare but powerful, plays a crucial role. When conditions align, when thresholds are crossed, the planet responds not with patience, but with force. These flood-carved landscapes also challenge human perception of time. To us, such vast changes feel impossible within a human-scale moment. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The land itself insists on a different narrative, one where transformation can occur within a single generation, or even a single day. For those who survived the floods, the scars would have served as constant reminders of vulnerability. The channels were not abstract features. They were boundaries, obstacles, and dangers woven into daily life. They shaped movement, settlement, and belief. Places where the earth had broken open would have inspired caution, reverence, or fear. Over time, stories may have grown around these features, attempts to explain their origin through memory and imagination. Floods become myths, channels become the paths of gods or monsters, and the land becomes a testament to forces beyond human control. In this way, geology and culture intertwine, each reinforcing the other. The rivers that should not exist are not anomalies to be dismissed. They are keys to understanding the planet's capacity for sudden change. They remind us that stability is conditional, dependent on balances that can fail. The scars they left behind are not just remnants of destruction, but records of transformation. Long after the waters receded, long after ice sheets vanished and new climates took hold, these channels continued to shape the world. They influenced where forests grew, where animals traveled, where humans settled. They became part of the foundation upon which later histories were built. In the end, these landscapes stand as a warning written in stone. They tell a story not of gradual erosion, but of unleashed power. They reveal that the earth, when pushed beyond its limits, can remake itself with terrifying speed, and they remind us that beneath the surface of apparent stability, forces may be waiting, silent, immense, and unstoppable. As the great floods reshaped the land, another transformation unfolded more slowly, but with equal finality. The oceans, long held back by the immense storage of ice on land, began to reclaim what had been taken from them. Sea levels rose not as a single smooth motion, but impulses, surges tied to the sudden release of glacial waters. Coastlines shifted year by year, sometimes almost imperceptibly, sometimes with frightening speed. Lands that had existed for generations found themselves standing at the edge of encroaching water, their futures quietly erased. Vast coastal plains, once exposed and fertile, became increasingly unstable. These lands had supported rich ecosystems and human communities, threaded with rivers that flowed toward distant seas. As water levels climbed, salt water crept inland, contaminating freshwater sources and altering soils. Long before complete submersion occurred, plants adapted to dry, cold conditions struggled in the changing chemistry. Animals lost grazing grounds that had been reliable for centuries. The land began to fail its inhabitants before it disappeared entirely. The drowning of these ancient lands did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded across generations, creating a slow-motion disaster that forced repeated adaptation. Camps were moved inland. Seasonal routes shifted. Familiar landmarks vanished beneath waves, leaving memory as the only trace of their existence. For people who lived close to the sea, the horizon itself changed. The place where the sun met the land retreated year after year, a subtle but relentless reminder that the world was shrinking. What makes this loss particularly profound is that these submerged regions were not marginal edges of habitation. They were central corridors of life and movement. Exposed continental shelves connected distant regions, allowing humans and animals to migrate freely. These landscapes supported forests, wetlands, and grasslands, all now hidden beneath modern seas. Their disappearance fragmented populations, isolating groups that had once been linked by open land. Rivers that once flowed across these plains were transformed into estuaries and bays. Freshwater ecosystems gave way to brackish environments, then to fully marine conditions. Fish species changed. Birds altered migration patterns. The ecological identity of entire regions shifted. Life adapted where it could, but not without loss. The transition from land to sea erased complexity, replacing varied landscapes with uniform water. For human communities, the rising seas posed a different kind of threat than the sudden floods inland. There was no single moment of terror, no overwhelming wall of water. Instead, there was a creeping inevitability. Each year brought slightly higher tides, slightly deeper floods during storms. Choices became constrained. Stay and risk everything, or leave and abandon ancestral lands. Neither option was easy. This gradual loss likely left deep emotional scars. Places are not just physical spaces, they are anchors of identity. To watch the land that holds stories, memories, and meaning disappear beneath water is to experience a form of grief that transcends survival. Even as people adapted, something irreplaceable was gone. The land did not simply vanish, it was taken, slowly and without negotiation. The sea itself became a more complex and unpredictable force. As coastlines changed, currents shifted. New bays and inlets altered tidal patterns, sometimes amplifying storm surges and erosion. Areas that had once been sheltered became exposed. The interface between land and sea grew unstable, constantly reshaped by waves and rising water. This instability made long-term settlement difficult, reinforcing mobility and uncertainty. The drowning of ancient lands also reshaped human perception of the world. The boundary between land and water, once stable within memory, proved fluid and unreliable. Trust in the permanence of place was undermined. The environment was no longer a fixed backdrop, but an active agent capable of erasing entire regions. This realization would have profound implications for how humans related to nature. Over time, The memory of these lost lands may have transformed into stories, tales of sunken worlds, submerged paths, and lands swallowed by the sea, appear in cultures around the globe. While myth cannot be equated directly with history, it often preserves emotional truths. The experience of watching the land disappear would have demanded explanation, meaning, and narrative from a geological perspective. The scale of this submergence is staggering. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over the course of the transition, reshaping every coastline on Earth. Islands formed where hills once stood. Narrow land bridges vanished, severing connections between continents. The modern map of the world began to emerge, built upon the remains of drowned landscapes. What lies beneath the sea today is not empty. It is a layered archive of forests, rivers, and human activity, preserved in darkness and sediment. In some places, submerged tree stumps still stand rooted in ancient soils. In others, river channels snake across the seabed, visible to those who know how to look. These features are silent witnesses to a time when the ocean was far away. For the people who lived through this transition, adaptation was relentless. Knowledge had to be rewritten. Routes learned over generations were rendered obsolete. New relationships with water had to be formed, balancing its benefits with its dangers. Fishing may have become more important as terrestrial resources declined. Boats and coastal navigation grew in significance as land routes disappeared, yet adaptation does not erase loss. Even as new opportunities emerged, the disappearance of ancient lands marked the end of a world. The rhythms of life tied to those places could not be fully replaced. Something fundamental had changed, not just in geography, but in the human experience of place. The drowning of these lands stands as one of the most consequential events in human prehistory. It shaped migration patterns, cultural development, and the distribution of populations across the globe. It created the coastlines we now take for granted, while burying the landscapes that came before. In the end, the rising seas were not merely a consequence of melting ice. They were an agent of transformation in their own right. They erased, redefined, and reshaped the world with quiet persistence. Long after the dramatic floods faded from memory, the slow advance of the ocean continued its work, reminding every generation that the land beneath their feet was never guaranteed to remain. As the waters continued their advance, something more subtle, but perhaps even more profound, was taking place: the disappearance of an entire world that would leave almost no trace in human memory. Vast regions that had once been central to life, movement, and connection slipped beneath the sea, not with violence, but with finality. These were not marginal lands on the edge of existence. They were the heartlands of a vanished geography, places where rivers met plains, where animals migrated freely, and where humans had lived for generations, without ever imagining the ocean would one day claim their home. This forgotten world existed in the space between what we know and what we assume has always been so. Today's seas feel ancient and permanent, but for most of human history, they were not there. What are now submerged shelves were once open land, broad, gently sloping plains that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. These landscapes connected continents, softened distances, and allowed life to flow across regions that are now isolated by water. Their loss reshaped the human story as deeply as any technological or cultural shift. Life on these plains was shaped by abundance and movement. Rivers braided across open ground, feeding wetlands and forests that supported diverse ecosystems. Animals congregated along these waterways, and humans followed, establishing seasonal camps and long-term routes that formed the backbone of social networks. These lands were not static settlements, but dynamic spaces where interaction, exchange, and adaptation thrived. When the seas began to rise, these regions did not vanish overnight. First, the changes were subtle: flooded river mouths, expanding marshes, saltwater intrusion into freshwater systems. But over time, the encroachment became undeniable. Each generation witnessed a slightly altered landscape. A familiar place diminished or transformed. What had once been solid ground became unreliable, then impassable, and finally unreachable. The tragedy of this disappearance lies in its silence. There were no monuments left behind, no enduring ruins to mark what was lost. As the waters rose, they erased footprints, campsites and pathways with equal indifference. Organic materials decayed, stone tools were scattered or buried. The sea became both destroyer and preserver, sealing fragments of this world beneath layers of sediment and darkness. As connections between regions were severed, isolation reshaped human societies. Groups that had once interacted regularly found themselves separated by growing bodies of water. Shared traditions diverged. Languages changed, genetic lineages followed new paths. The disappearance of these lands did not just alter geography, it redefined identity. For those living through it, the loss was not abstract. It was personal. Places where ancestors had lived, hunted, and told stories were gone. Routes remembered from childhood led nowhere. The world grew smaller, more fragmented. Adaptation was possible, but continuity was broken. Memory could not compete with the ocean's persistence. Over time, as generations passed, the knowledge of these submerged lands faded. Children grew up knowing only the world as it existed after the waters had claimed it. Stories of former plains and distant crossings may have survived for a while, transformed into legends or half-remembered myths, but without physical reference points, they lost clarity. The sea became eternal in the human imagination, and the land beneath it slipped into obscurity. This is why the world that disappeared feels so distant to us now. It left few visible scars, unlike the dramatic flood channels carved inland. Its erasure was smooth, continuous, and thorough. The ocean does not leave ruins, it absorbs them. And in doing so, it removes the evidence that might remind us how recently these places existed. Yet the impact of this loss is written into the structure of the modern world. Coastlines define political boundaries, cultural identities, and economic systems. The shapes of continents influence climate, migration, and history. All of this rests on the disappearance of land that once connected rather than divided. The modern map is a consequence of that erasure. Beneath the waves, the remnants of this forgotten world remain. Submerged forests still stand in some places, their trunks preserved in cold, oxygen-poor waters. Ancient river channels are etched into the seabed, visible through sonar and satellite mapping. These features confirm what human memory could not retain, that the ocean floor was once alive with terrestrial ecosystems. For archaeologists and geologists, these submerged landscapes are among the most tantalizing and inaccessible archives of human history. They likely hold evidence of early habitation, migration, and adaptation that will never be fully recovered. Rising seas did not just erase land, they erased chapters of the human story before they could be written. The disappearance of this world also changed how humans related to water. Seas became barriers instead of pathways, sources of food, but also of danger. The unpredictability of coastlines reinforced a sense of impermanence. Land could no longer be assumed to last. Stability was conditional, dependent on forces far beyond human influence. In a deeper sense, this loss reshaped human consciousness. It reinforced the idea that the world is not fixed, that what exists now is not guaranteed to exist forever. This awareness may have influenced later cultural developments, rituals, myths, and philosophies centered on cycles, loss, and renewal. When the land itself can disappear, nothing feels entirely secure. The forgotten world beneath the sea is not merely a geological curiosity. It is a reminder of how much of our past lies beyond reach, erased not by time alone, but by transformation. It challenges the assumption that history unfolds only on solid ground. Much of it unfolded on land that no longer exists. As we stand on modern shores, looking out across oceans that feel ancient and immutable, it is difficult to imagine that these waters were once distant horizons. Yet, not long ago, in the scale of human existence, people walked where waves now roll. Their world did not end in fire or collapse, but in silence, as the sea rose and claimed it. This is the disappearance that shaped everything that followed. Not a single moment of destruction, but the gradual, irreversible loss of a world that had supported life for thousands of years. It left no ruins, no clear ending, only absence. And in that absence, The modern world was born as the physical traces of catastrophe settled into the land and sea. Another record began to form, one not written in stone or sediment, but in human memory. Faced with events too vast, too sudden, and too destructive to fully understand, people turned to story. Long before writing, before monuments or chronicles, experience was preserved through spoken narrative, and among the most powerful of these narratives were stories of water, of overwhelming floods, of land swallowed whole, of survival granted or denied by forces beyond human control. These stories did not emerge as objective accounts. They were shaped by emotion, fear, awe, and the need to find meaning in chaos. When rivers burst beyond anything remembered, when familiar plains vanished beneath rising seas, explanation became as important as survival. To live in a world that could erase itself demanded a framework that made such power intelligible. Myth became that framework, across distant regions and cultures that would later have no contact with one another. Similar themes appeared. Water as destroyer, water as cleanser, water as the boundary between one world and the next. Floods sent by higher forces, survived by a few, followed by renewal. These parallels are striking, not because they prove a single event remembered everywhere, but because they reveal a shared human response to overwhelming environmental change. In societies without scientific language, memory relies on metaphor. A rising sea becomes a devouring being. A collapsing ice dam becomes an act of divine anger. Survival becomes favor or destiny. These interpretations were not naive, they were functional. They preserved the emotional truth of experience, even as details shifted with retelling. The lesson was not about water volume or climate systems. It was about humility, vulnerability, and respect for forces that could not be controlled. Flood myths often carry a dual nature. They speak of destruction, but also of rebirth. The old world is washed away, but something new emerges. This reflects lived reality. After catastrophe, ecosystems recovered. New landscapes formed, human groups adapted, rebuilt, and continued. Memory captured both loss and continuity, embedding them into stories that could be passed on. Importantly, these narratives often emphasize warning and neglect. Floods arrived because signs were ignored, because balance was broken, because people failed to live in harmony with the world. Whether or not such moral framing reflects actual causes, it reveals a deep awareness that survival depends on attentiveness. In a world shaped by environmental uncertainty, ignoring change could be fatal. As generations passed, the original landscapes that inspired these stories disappeared completely. Coastlines stabilized, rivers settled into new paths, ice vanished from regions where it had once defined the horizon. Without physical reference points, memory transformed. Stories became less about specific places and more about universal truths. The flood was no longer tied to a particular valley or plain, but to the world itself. This transformation is why flood myths feel timeless. They are not anchored to geography we can easily identify. They exist in a symbolic space, one that allows them to persist. Even as the world changes, the sea that once swallowed land becomes the same sea generations later take for granted. The story remains, even as its origin fades, yet fragments of real experience likely persisted within these myths. Descriptions of waters rising suddenly, of animals fleeing, of survival on high ground or floating debris. These details echo what would have been witnessed during glacial outburst floods and rapid sea level rise. While the stories cannot be treated as historical records, they should not be dismissed as pure invention either. They are emotional fossils, preserving how catastrophe felt to those who lived through it. The spread of such stories also reflects migration. As people were displaced by floods and rising seas, they carried memory with them. Settling in new regions, they retold old stories, adapting them to new landscapes. Over time, these narratives blended with local traditions, producing diverse versions of similar themes. The flood became a shared ancestral memory, reshaped by each culture it touched. In this way, catastrophe influenced not only where people lived, but how they understood the world. Water became sacred and feared. Rituals emerged around rivers, seas, and rain. Offerings were made. Boundaries were marked. The environment was no longer just a source of resources, but a force requiring respect and negotiation. Myth also served as a warning across generations. By embedding the memory of destruction into story, societies ensured that future generations would remember the possibility of sudden change, even if they never experienced it themselves. The details might blur, but the core message remained. The world can change faster than you expect. What is remarkable is not that flood myths exist, but that they endured. In a world without writing, memory is fragile. Stories survive only if they remain relevant. The persistence of flood narratives suggests that they resonated deeply, touching something fundamental about human experience. They spoke to vulnerability, loss, and survival conditions that continue to define life long after the original floods had passed. In time, these stories would be written down, fixed into texts that gave them the appearance of permanence. But by then, their origins were already distant. What had once been lived experience became sacred history. The emotional truth endured even as the environmental context faded. Modern science approaches these myths cautiously, aware of the temptation to read literal history into symbolic narrative, yet dismissing them entirely misses their value. They reveal how humans processed extreme change, how memory adapts when reality is too large to fully contain. They show that long before data and models, people recognized the power of water to reshape the world. The floods that followed the melting of ice did more than alter landscapes. They entered the human imagination, shaping belief systems that would influence culture for thousands of years. They taught lessons about impermanence, humility, and renewal that still resonate today. When we hear these stories now, separated by millennia, they may feel abstract or fantastical, but at their core lies a simple truth. The world once changed in ways that defied expectation, and people remembered that change the only way they could, by turning it into story. In those myths, the past is not preserved as a timeline, but as a feeling. Fear of rising water, awe at its power, gratitude for survival, mourning for what was lost. These emotions are as real now as they were then, and through them, the memory of a world reshaped by floods continues to flow long after the waters themselves have settled. Surviving a world that changes suddenly leaves marks deeper than any physical scar. For those who lived through the floods and the rising seas, survival was not just a matter of escaping water or finding new land. It was a psychological rupture, a breaking of assumptions about how the world works and what can be relied upon. Trauma did not announce itself as a single moment of terror and then fade. It lingered, shaping behavior, memory, and culture long after the immediate danger had passed. In small, closely bonded communities, loss was personal and unavoidable. When land disappeared, it was not anonymous territory that vanished, but places filled with meaning, camps where children had grown, hunting grounds known through generations, paths walked countless times. All were gone. People were lost as well, swept away by floods or left behind during forced migrations. There were no rituals of closure, no graves to return to. Absence became a constant companion. This kind of loss alters how people see the future. When stability proves illusory, planning becomes cautious, even pessimistic. Trust in long-term certainty erodes. Communities that had once relied on predictable cycles learned that those cycles could fail. This awareness likely changed decision-making, encouraging flexibility over permanence, movement over settlement, redundancy over efficiency. Survival strategies shifted from optimizing the present to preparing for disruption. Trauma also reshapes memory. Not everything can be carried forward in detail. Instead, memory compresses experience into symbols and emotions. Fear becomes a warning. Loss becomes a lesson. Survival becomes proof of meaning or favor. In this way, the emotional weight of catastrophe is preserved even as specific details fade. The flood becomes not just an event, but a reference point, a before and after that organizes time itself. For individuals, the psychological impact may have manifested as heightened alertness, a river swelling unexpectedly, a storm lasting too long, a shoreline changing shape. These could trigger anxiety rooted in lived experience. Vigilance became adaptive. In a world where change had proven deadly, caution was a form of intelligence. Those who paid attention survived longer. Children growing up in the aftermath inherited not the event itself, but its emotional residue. They learned through behavior and story that the world was unpredictable. Elders' caution, reluctance to settle too close to water, or insistence on mobility carried lessons shaped by trauma. Even without explicit explanation, fear was transmitted through habit and warning. Community bonds may have deepened under this shared experience. Trauma isolates individuals, but shared trauma can unite groups. Survival depended on cooperation more than ever. Trust, mutual aid, and collective memory became essential. Groups that fragmented were more vulnerable. Those that reinforced social cohesion had a better chance of adapting to new realities. Yet trauma also carries the risk of fracture. Displacement strains relationships. Scarcity intensifies conflict. When resources are limited and uncertainty high, cooperation competes with survival instincts. Some groups likely splintered under pressure, their members seeking different strategies or territories. The human story after the floods was not uniformly resilient. It was uneven, marked by success and failure alike. One of the most profound effects of survival trauma is the reshaping of identity. People define themselves partly by place. When place is lost, identity must adapt. Communities displaced by rising seas or devastated landscapes had to redefine who they were without the anchors that once grounded them. This process takes time, and it often relies on narrative stories that explain why loss occurred and what it means. These narratives served multiple purposes. They offered comfort, framing survival as meaningful rather than random. They provided continuity, linking the past to an altered present. And they imposed order on chaos, transforming incomprehensible events into stories that could be shared and remembered. In this way, trauma became the foundation of cultural expression. Environmental trauma also influenced how people related to risk. In a stable world, risk can be managed. In an unstable one, risk is ever present. This awareness likely fostered adaptability and innovation. New tools, new routes, new subsistence strategies emerged not from abstract progress, but from necessity. Humans did not simply endure, they experimented. But experimentation carries cost. Mistakes in an unstable environment are punished quickly. Failed adaptations could mean starvation or exposure. The pressure to adapt efficiently was intense. Cultural evolution accelerated, driven by selective survival of practices that worked under new conditions. Emotionally, the floods may have fostered a sense of humility before nature. The illusion of control, fragile to begin with, was shattered. Water had proven capable of erasing entire worlds. This recognition likely influenced belief systems, reinforcing respect, fear, or reverence toward natural forces. Nature was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in human fate. At the same time, survival fostered resilience. To live through catastrophe and continue is to prove adaptability at a fundamental level. Humans are not defined solely by what they lose, but by what they manage to preserve. Skills, relationships, knowledge, all carried forward despite disruption. Survival itself became a form of quiet triumph. The trauma of survival does not fade quickly. It becomes layered into culture, shaping norms and values long after the original events are forgotten. Caution around water, rituals tied to seasons, taboos against certain places. These may all trace their origins to lived experiences of loss and danger. What begins as response becomes tradition. It is important to recognize that trauma is not weakness. It is evidence of sensitivity to reality. A species that cannot be shaken by catastrophe would also fail to adapt to it. The emotional impact of the floods was part of what enabled humans to survive them. Fear encouraged caution. Grief reinforced memory, anxiety sharpened attention. Over generations, as environments stabilized, some of this heightened alertness may have softened. But it never disappeared entirely. The memory of instability remained embedded in culture, resurfacing in story, ritual, and belief. Even in times of relative calm, the knowledge that the world could change suddenly persisted. The trauma of survival also shaped how humans viewed time. The past was no longer a guarantee of the future. Continuity could not be assumed. This awareness may have encouraged flexibility in thinking, openness to change, and an understanding that adaptation is ongoing rather than final. In the end, the floods did more than reshape land. They reshaped the human mind. They forced a reckoning with impermanence that would echo through history. Survival was not just about finding dry ground. It was about learning to live in a world where ground itself could disappear. The legacy of that trauma is still with us, in our stories, our fears, and our fascination with catastrophe. The echoes remain. The people who survived the floods carried forward not just life, but memory, encoded not in dates or maps, but in emotion. And through that emotional inheritance, the experience of a world undone by water continues to shape how humanity understands its place on a changing planet. After destruction, the world did not remain empty for long. Nature rarely tolerates absence. Where water had torn through land, where ice had withdrawn and seas had advanced, new patterns slowly began to form. The chaos of collapse gave way to a quieter phase of reorganization, one that unfolded over generations rather than moments. This was not a return to what had existed before, but the emergence of something fundamentally different, a new world shaped by loss, opportunity, and adaptation. As climates warmed and stabilized, vegetation began to reclaim exposed ground. In places stripped to bare rock, life returned cautiously, beginning with hardy pioneer species that could tolerate poor soils and extreme conditions. Mosses, grasses, and small shrubs took hold, breaking down stone and trapping sediment. Over time, soils deepened, allowing more complex plant communities to emerge. Forests expanded into regions that had once been tundra or steppe, reshaping ecosystems from the ground up. Animals followed these changes closely. Species that thrived in cold, open environments retreated northward or vanished entirely. Others moved in to exploit new habitats. Herds adapted their migration routes to the changing geography, or predators adjusted to new prey and terrain. The distribution of life shifted dramatically, redrawing ecological boundaries that had existed for thousands of years. Wetlands became particularly important in this emerging world. Depressions left by melting ice and flood scouring filled with water, creating rich environments that supported birds, fish, and plant life. These areas acted as ecological anchors, stabilizing local climates and providing reliable resources. They also attracted human groups, offering food, water, and relative predictability in an otherwise changing landscape. Rivers, too, found new identities, settled into the oversized channels carved by floods, flowing gently through spaces that once carried unimaginable force. Others established entirely new courses, responding to altered slopes and drainage patterns. Over time, these rivers became lifelines, shaping settlement, movement, and interaction. What had once been agents of destruction transformed into sources of sustenance. For humans, this emerging world demanded new strategies. The skills owned during the Ice Age, mobility, adaptability, deep environmental awareness, remained valuable, but the context had changed. Resources were distributed differently. Seasons shifted. The relationship between land and water required reassessment. Survival once again depended on learning, observation, and flexibility. In many regions, increased plant growth supported greater animal diversity and density. This abundance allowed some human groups to reduce their mobility, staying longer in favorable locations. Seasonal movement did not disappear, but patterns softened. Familiar places regained importance, not as immutable anchors, but as recurring nodes in a dynamic landscape. With stability came opportunity. Humans experimented with new tools, new materials, and new ways of organizing life. Fishing gained prominence along coasts and rivers reshaped by rising seas. Wetland resources supplemented hunting and gathering. Diets diversified. These changes were not revolutions, but gradual adjustments driven by environment rather than intention. The emotional tone of life also shifted. The immediate terror of catastrophe faded, replaced by cautious optimism. Loss was still remembered, but it no longer dominated daily experience. The world felt livable again, even if it remained unpredictable. This balance between caution and hope defined the emerging era. Importantly, the new world carried the imprint of what had been lost. Landscapes bore scars of floods and melting ice, shaping movement and settlement choices. Cultural memory, even when abstracted into myth, influenced behavior. People avoided certain places, respected water in new ways, and remained alert to signs of change. The past was not gone, it was integrated. The emergence of this new world also reshaped human relationships with other species. As ecosystems reorganized, humans learned to exploit new resources while managing risk. Knowledge expanded, incorporating lessons from a changing environment. This adaptability would prove crucial in the centuries to come. Over time, regional differences became more pronounced. Some areas flourished quickly, benefiting from fertile soils and stable climates. Others remained challenging, shaped by lingering instability or resource scarcity. These differences influenced migration, interaction, and cultural development, contributing to the diversity of human experience. What is striking about this phase is its quiet resilience. There were no grand declarations of recovery, no clear moment marking the transition from catastrophe to renewal. Life simply continued, adjusting step by step. The absence of drama does not diminish its significance. In many ways, survival and adaptation are most remarkable when they occur without spectacle. The new world that emerged was not better or worse than the one that had been lost. It was different. Its possibilities and constraints were shaped by forces beyond human control. Yet humans found ways to live within them. This ability to adapt, to accept change without surrender, is a defining feature of our species. As generations passed, children grew up knowing only this altered landscape. The scars of catastrophe became part of the natural order, features of the land, rather than reminders of trauma. Stories of floods and lost lands persisted, but they belonged to a distant past. The present demanded attention, and it offered opportunities for growth. In this emerging world, humanity took important steps toward new forms of life. Increased stability allowed for experimentation with settlement, social organization, and resource management. These developments would eventually lead to profound changes in how humans lived and interacted with the environment. Yet even as the world stabilized, it retained the potential for change. The lessons of the floods were never entirely forgotten. The knowledge that the earth could transform rapidly remained embedded in culture and memory, tempering confidence with humility. The birth of this new world was not a single event, but a process, a slow unfolding shaped by recovery, adaptation, and resilience. It demonstrated that even after immense loss, life finds ways to reorganize and continue. The planet does not return to what it was, but it does not remain broken either. From the ruins of ice and flood emerged landscapes that would support future civilizations, cultures, and histories. The world that followed was built upon the remnants of what came before, carrying forward both scars and lessons. And in that continuity, imperfect, fragile, and dynamic, the story of humanity moved forward, shaped forever by the waters that once reshaped everything. As the planet continued to settle into its warmer state, the boundaries between land and water began to stabilize, giving rise to the shorelines that feel familiar today. This was not an abrupt transformation, but a gradual drawing of new edges, shaped by tides, currents, and the slow redistribution of sediment. Bays, estuaries, and inland seas emerged where rising waters met uneven terrain, creating complex coastlines rich with ecological possibility. These new shorelines were dynamic environments, constantly reshaped by the movement of water. Waves eroded cliffs, rivers carried sediment from inland floods, and tides redistributed sand and silt along the coast. Over time, this interplay sculpted beaches, deltas, and barrier islands. The land did not simply surrender to the sea. It negotiated, forming a boundary that shifted with each season and storm. Inland seas formed in places where water became trapped between rising land and advancing oceans. These bodies of water created unique microclimates, moderating temperatures and supporting diverse ecosystems. Salt and freshwater mixed in estuaries, producing some of the most productive environments on Earth. Fish, birds, and plants thrived in these transitional zones, taking advantage of nutrient-rich waters and protected habitats. For humans, these emerging shorelines offered new opportunities and challenges. Coastal environments provided abundant food sources: fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and edible plants that could be harvested with relatively simple tools. This abundance encouraged longer stays and more frequent return to favored locations. At the same time, the unpredictability of tides and storms demanded respect and caution. Living near water required new forms of knowledge and skill. The relationship between humans and the sea evolved rapidly. Water was no longer just something that destroyed or displaced. It became a source of sustenance and connection. Fishing techniques developed, simple watercraft emerged, allowing people to navigate rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. These innovations expanded mobility in new directions, even as land routes disappeared beneath the sea. Shorelines also became points of interaction. Groups traveling along coasts encountered one another more frequently, sharing knowledge, materials, and ideas. The coast acted as a corridor, facilitating movement and communication. Cultural exchange accelerated, contributing to diversity and innovation. The sea, once a barrier, became a bridge. As coastlines stabilized, they began to influence climate on a regional scale. Coastal winds moderated temperatures, reducing extremes. Moisture from the sea supported vegetation inland. These effects created gradients of habitability, influencing where people settled and how they moved across the landscape. The formation of modern seas also reshaped global circulation. As freshwater input from melting ice decreased, ocean currents reorganized, establishing patterns that continue to influence climate today. These currents redistributed heat, stabilizing conditions in some regions while introducing variability in others. The planet entered a new climatic regime, one defined by open oceans rather than extensive ice. Over generations, these changes became the new normal. Children grew up with coastlines that no longer moved dramatically year to year. The memory of relentless sea level rise faded, replaced by an assumption of stability. This perception encouraged deeper investment in coastal environments, reinforcing their importance in human life. Yet even as stability increased, the legacy of change remained. Coastal erosion continued. Storms reshaped shorelines, tides rose and fell. The boundary between land and sea was never fixed, only temporarily balanced. This tension kept humans attentive, reinforcing lessons learned during earlier upheaval. Culturally, the sea took on layered meaning. It was a provider, a pathway, a boundary, and a reminder of loss. Rituals, stories, and beliefs reflected this complexity. The sea was respected not only for its generosity, but for its capacity to take away. The emergence of shorelines also influenced how humans conceptualize space. Boundaries became clearer. Territories were defined by coasts, rivers, and bays. Navigation skills improved as people learned to read currents, winds, and stars. Orientation shifted from purely terrestrial markers to include maritime ones. Inland, the effects of these new seas were felt through altered weather patterns and resource distribution. Moisture from the ocean supported forests and grasslands, while inland areas experienced different seasonal rhythms. The interconnectedness of land and sea became increasingly apparent. The birth of shorelines and seas marked a transition from a world dominated by ice, to one shaped by water in motion. This new configuration allowed for greater ecological diversity and human adaptability. It laid the groundwork for future developments, including more permanent settlements and complex societies. Despite the relative calm of this phase, the planet retained its capacity for change. The stability of shorelines was contingent, dependent on climate and sea level remaining within certain bounds. The memory of past instability lingered, even if it no longer dominated daily life. Standing at the edge of these newly formed seas, humans encountered a world that felt both familiar and new. The land had changed, but life had found ways to thrive. The boundary between land and water, once a source of fear, became a space of possibility. The shorelines that emerged during this period are not just geographical features. They are the result of a long negotiation between ice, water, land, and life. They represent the planet finding a new balance after profound disruption, and within that balance, humanity found new ways to live, move, and imagine the world. This transformation did not erase the past. Beneath the waves and within the land, traces of earlier worlds remained. But the surface story had changed. Earth had entered a new chapter, one written along the edges of water. Where land meets sea, instability is always provisional. As the climate settled into a warmer and more predictable rhythm, humanity found itself standing at a crossroads, shaped by opportunity rather than immediate survival. For countless generations, movement had been essential. Mobility was insurance against uncertainty, a way to follow resources across landscapes that could change without warning. But now, in many regions, the world offered something new: reliability. Seasons still shifted, but within narrower bounds. Rivers flowed more consistently. Plant and animal life returned year after year to the same places. For the first time, staying put became a viable option. This was not a sudden decision or a universal transformation. It emerged unevenly, shaped by local environments and cultural traditions. In some areas, abundance encouraged longer stays. Wetlands, river valleys, and coastal zones provided dependable food sources that could support groups for extended periods. Familiar places gained new importance, not just as stopping points, but as homes returned to again and again. Settling did not mean abandoning movement altogether. Seasonal migration remained part of life, but its scale and urgency changed. Instead of ranging across vast territories, groups moved within smaller, more defined areas. Knowledge became more localized. People learned the detailed rhythms of particular landscapes, the timing of fish runs, the growth cycles of plants, the behavior of animals within a specific valley or shoreline. This intimacy with place deepened. With repeated return came investment. Shelters became more substantial. Tools were cached rather than carried. Certain locations accumulated layers of human activity, becoming centers of memory and meaning. These were not cities or villages in the modern sense, but they represented a shift in how humans related to land. Place was no longer just a resource to be used and left behind. It became something to care for, protect, and understand deeply. As people spent more time in one area, they began to notice patterns that mobility had previously obscured. Certain plants thrived when encouraged. Others could be cleared to promote growth of more useful species. The line between gathering and cultivating blurred. These early experiments were not driven by a desire to dominate nature, but by attentiveness to its possibilities. Humans responded to what the land offered. This gradual shift towards settlement altered social structures. Larger groups could remain together longer, strengthening bonds and enabling more complex cooperation. Roles diversified. Knowledge became more specialized. Some individuals focused on tool making, others on fishing, hunting, or plant processing. Shared spaces encouraged shared identity, reinforcing group cohesion. Time itself was experienced differently. When movement defines life, time is marked by travel and survival. When people remain in one place, time becomes layered. The past leaves physical traces, fires, tools, altered landscapes that can be revisited. Memory becomes anchored to location. This anchoring allows for longer-term thinking, planning beyond the immediate season. Children growing up in these environments learn not just how to survive, but how to belong. They inherited places as well as skills. Stories became tied to specific locations, embedding history into the land. This connection reinforced continuity across generations, creating a sense of lineage rooted in geography. The shift towards settlement also changed relationships with risk. Mobility had once been the primary response to danger. Now, adaptation increasingly involved modification, altering the environment to reduce uncertainty. Clearing land, managing water, and storing resources became strategies for stability. These practices required cooperation and foresight, reinforcing social organization. Yet settling was not without tension. Staying in one place increased vulnerability to local disasters, floods, droughts, or resource depletion. The memory of past catastrophes tempered confidence. Settlements were often placed with care, avoiding areas known to flood or erode. Caution shaped choice, informed by inherited knowledge and cultural memory. As humans learned to settle, they also learned to negotiate boundaries. Territories became more clearly defined, sometimes leading to conflict, sometimes to cooperation and exchange. Proximity allowed ideas and innovations to spread more rapidly. Technologies improved incrementally as people had time to refine tools and techniques rather than constantly replace them. This period marked a subtle but profound transformation in the human story. Survival was no longer the sole focus. Life expanded to include planning, experimentation, and cultural expression rooted in place. Artifacts accumulated. Rituals emerged tied to seasons and locations. The relationship between humans and their environment became more reciprocal. Importantly, this transition did not erase the lessons of the past. The memory of instability remained present, shaping cautious approaches to settlement. Flexibility was preserved. Many groups maintained the ability to move if necessary, keeping mobility as a backup rather than a constant requirement. Settlement was embraced not as permanence, but as possibility. Over generations, these practices laid the groundwork for later developments. The management of resources, the deepening of social bonds, and the anchoring of identity to place would eventually enable more complex societies. But at this stage, the changes were quiet, organic, and driven by environment rather than ambition. Humanity did not suddenly decide to settle the world. The world, changed by ice and water, made settlement possible. People responded, as they always had, by adapting. They learned to live within new limits, to recognize new opportunities, and to balance caution with curiosity. This was not the end of movement, nor the beginning of civilization as we recognize it today. It was a middle ground, a period of learning how to exist in a more stable yet still dynamic world. The habits formed here would shape the future, influencing how humans thought about land, ownership, and belonging. In choosing to settle, even temporarily, humans altered their relationship with time, place, and each other. They began to see the land not just as something passed through, but as something lived with. This shift, born from a world reshaped by melting ice and rising water, marked one of the most significant turning points in human history. The ability to settle did not make humans masters of their environment. It made them students of it, and in that attentive relationship, forged in the aftermath of catastrophe, the foundations of later human societies quietly took shape. Even as humans began to settle and adapt to the reshaped landscapes, the planet itself became an archive, preserving memories of the cataclysmic events that had transformed it. The land, ice, and water recorded stories far longer and more faithfully than any oral tradition could, embedding the history of floods, glacial retreats, and rising seas into its very structure. Every valley carved by torrents, every sediment layer deposited in the chaos of overflowing rivers, every submerged plain beneath modern oceans served as a silent testament to the past. Humans were only beginning to learn to read these subtle signatures, but the earth remembered with perfect fidelity. Sediments accumulated in layers that told stories of extremes, thick beds of gravel and sand, sometimes mixed with enormous boulders, indicated moments when water had surged across landscapes with unprecedented force. Fine silts and clays recorded quieter periods, intervals of stability between floods, when rivers meandered gently and vegetation stabilized the soil. These layers were not just inert material. They were a chronicle of rhythm and disruption, of calm punctuated by catastrophe. The deeper the layers, the further back in time they reached, preserving records of environments long erased from human memory. Rivers became living diaries of change. Channels carved during floods remained etched into the landscape, oversized and improbable, showing where waters had defied ordinary logic. Smaller streams shifted their courses over time, leaving abandoned channels and oxbow lakes that acted as snapshots of past flow. In each bend, in each deposit, the earth recorded the sequence of events that had once shaped it with dramatic immediacy. Even when modern rivers seemed placid, their forms bore the imprint of violence from centuries earlier. Ice itself retained history. Glaciers that survived in higher elevations carried with them debris and rock polished by thousands of years of movement. Moraines, ridges of earth and stone pushed ahead by ice, marked the furthest reach of glacial advance, while retreating ice left behind irregular deposits that hinted at instability and sudden melting. Within the ice, trapped air bubbles contained samples of the atmosphere at the time they formed, freezing a chemical snapshot of climate, composition, and even volcanic events. Ice was not merely frozen water. It was a multidimensional archive, a record of planetary stress and release. Coastal regions offered their own testimony. Rising seas submerged plains and valleys, covering traces of human and animal activity with layers of sand and mud. Underwater, the skeletal remains of forests, submerged riverbeds, and sediments carried signs of an era before inundation. Even today, remote sensing reveals the extent of these lost lands, the outlines of vanished ecosystems, and hints of human habitation. The sea preserves the past differently from the land, shielding it from wind and erosion, creating a repository that is both inaccessible and profoundly telling. Humans, while aware of these transformations in a practical sense, could not always interpret them in full. Tools, bones, and temporary structures buried in sediment or submerged beneath rising waters were fragments of a larger story. People understood these places functionally. They knew where a river would provide fish, or where floods could be dangerous. But the long-term history embedded in the earth was largely invisible. Still, some awareness persisted in cultural memory, in stories about rising waters, shifting rivers, and lost lands. Myth and experience intersected with physical traces, creating layered records that combined observation, oral history, and natural archive. The soil itself held memory. Nutrient-rich layers deposited by floods preserved evidence of plant life that had once thrived. Pollen trapped in sediments could reveal the composition of past forests, the spread of grasslands, and the arrival of species adapted to warmer climates. In some places, charcoal from ancient fires marked human activity, indicating settlements or land management practices before landscapes were overtaken by water. These minute details, invisible to the casual observer, were encoded history waiting to be read. Geology, over long periods, accentuated these archives. Bedrock exposed by floods, polished smooth by torrents, retained physical evidence of water's power. Scablands, channels, and ripple marks recorded flow rates and directions, revealing the dynamics of catastrophic events. Even in regions where sediments were later buried, the traces influenced future soil composition, vegetation patterns, and water flow. The earth carried forward its history not as static evidence, but as active influence on future development. Mountains, hills, and elevated regions also held stories. As ice retreated, landscapes that had been compressed and weighed down slowly rebounded, altering drainage patterns and creating basins that would later become lakes. Uplifted terraces indicated previous water levels and glacial extents. Rocks carried striations, fractures, and deposits that revealed the forces applied during ice movement. Each elevation, slope, and depression became a piece of the larger puzzle, a chapter in a planetary narrative written over tens of thousands of years. The significance of these natural archives extended beyond scientific curiosity. For humans, they created a subtle framework for understanding, and navigating the environment. The shape of a valley, the size and placement of boulders, the course of a river, all these features offered clues about risk, abundance, and resource availability. Experience combined with observation allowed early communities to interpret the memory embedded in the land, even if they could not conceptualize the full temporal scale. Earth's history was both guide and warning, shaping human behavior through the environment itself. Even submerged regions held potential for memory, though inaccessible to daily life. Underwater sediments preserved the footprint of pre-flood landscapes, ancient riverbeds, tree stumps, and human artifacts remained intact beneath layers of silt. These repositories were silent, yet they recorded the full narrative of life before inundation, from flora and fauna to human occupation and migration. In time, the evidence beneath the sea would offer insights into human resilience and adaptation, revealing a continuity of life despite catastrophic disruption. Archive of the Earth is cumulative, integrating ice, water, soil, and rock into a coherent system of memory. Each element responds to the forces applied upon it, retains information, and influences subsequent change. Human actions, from hunting to settlement, add their own traces, interacting with environmental records to create a layered and dynamic chronicle. This interaction between natural processes and human experience forms a tapestry that connects past catastrophes with ongoing adaptation. In understanding that memory is written into the land itself, humans gain not only practical knowledge, but a philosophical perspective. The Earth does not forget. It preserves evidence of both calm and catastrophe, stability and upheaval. Each landscape is a testament to forces far greater than a single lifetime, a reminder that the planet's history is encoded in the physical world. This awareness fosters humility, a recognition of human fragility, and the importance of attentiveness to environmental cues. In the aftermath of the floods and ice retreat, humans began to develop an intuitive sense of this archive. Seasonal observations, stories, and cultural practices intersected with physical traces to inform decisions about settlement, movement, and survival. The landscape itself became a teacher, offering lessons that could not be learned through oral transmission alone. Every riverbed, sediment layer, and glacial deposit carried warnings and guidance, linking past events to present choices. Ultimately, memory written into stone and soil is a testament to the persistence of life amid change. Catastrophe reshaped the world, but the Earth preserved its own story. Humans, in turn, learned to navigate, interpret, and adapt, embedding their own narrative into this enduring archive. The planet remembers, long after individual lives have passed, carrying forward the lessons of destruction and renewal for all who come after. Even thousands of years after the great floods and the retreat of the ice, the echoes could still be felt in the world humans inhabited. Rivers that had once carved impossible channels now flowed gently, their extraordinary power reduced to ordinary currents. Coastlines stabilized, forming the bays, estuaries, and shores that became familiar anchors for human settlement. Yet the memory of rapid change, of water's capacity to reshape everything in an instant, lingered not just in oral tradition or myth, but in the very structure of landscapes, in patterns of rivers and valleys, and in the cautious awareness that humans carried into daily life. For modern observers, these echoes can also be found in scientific records, revealing parallels between ancient upheavals and contemporary concerns. The same forces that once triggered megafloods, rapid ice melt, destabilized glaciers, rising seas remain at work, albeit in a different context. Observing these historical patterns provides both awe and a subtle warning. Earth is capable of swift transformation when certain thresholds are crossed, a reminder that the planet's equilibrium is conditional, not permanent. Ancient floods also illuminate the relationship between humans and their environment. Our ancestors experienced profound loss, yet they adapted. Populations relocated, technologies evolved, and societies reorganized. This historical resilience contrasts with modern perceptions of vulnerability and highlights enduring strategies for coping with environmental stress. By studying the past, we gain perspective on contemporary challenges, Understanding how life persists and reorganizes after profound disruption, the physical traces of these events offer direct evidence of their magnitude. Oversized river channels, boulders transported far from their origin, and sediment layers laid down in violent floods are visible today. Frozen in stone and soil, these features dwarf human scales, emphasizing the power of natural forces relative to individual lifetimes. The contrast between human fragility and environmental might is stark, reinforcing humility and awareness of limits. Yet, the flood's legacy is not solely destructive. They also created new opportunities. Channels carved by glacial outburst floods became fertile valleys and transport routes once waters receded. Deposits of nutrient-rich sediments fostered plant growth, attracting animals and, eventually, humans who relied on these revitalized landscapes. In this sense, catastrophe was intertwined with creation. Destruction laid the groundwork for new forms of life and human settlement. Coastal regions bear particular significance. Rising seas submerged ancient plains, reconfiguring coastlines and isolating populations that had once been connected. The resulting geography shaped human migration, resource availability, and social interaction. The formation of estuaries and sheltered bays created environments conducive to fishing and gathering, while altering traditional inland pathways. Humans were forced to reassess their relationship with the sea, learning to navigate both its opportunities and its dangers. Cultural memory reflected these shifts. Stories of drowned lands, catastrophic floods, and divine retribution circulated across generations. Such narratives were not mere entertainment. They were encoded survival strategies. They emphasized attentiveness to environmental cues, respect for the power of water, and awareness of vulnerability. In many ways, myths preserved experiential knowledge that could not be conveyed through observation alone. They offered emotional context, integrating fear, awe, and practical guidance. Beyond local contexts, these echoes influenced regional and global patterns. As ice sheets retreated, ocean currents reorganized, affecting climate and ecological systems worldwide. Freshwater input from melting glaciers altered salinity, influencing circulation patterns that shaped temperature and weather over vast areas. These changes were interconnected, demonstrating how localized events can ripple across the planet. Ancient floods thus offer insight into Earth's systemic sensitivity, illustrating the interplay between ice, water, and climate over millennia. From a philosophical perspective, these echoes challenge human assumptions about permanence and control. Landscapes that appear stable today bear hidden histories of upheaval. Species, including humans, have survived repeated transformation, yet our security is always provisional. Understanding the past fosters humility and encourages a long-term perspective, reminding us that adaptability is more valuable than dominance, observation more instructive than assumption. Modern parallels further highlight the relevance of ancient floods. Rising sea levels, glacial melt, and extreme weather events in our time resonate with past patterns, illustrating that Earth's capacity for rapid transformation remains. By studying ancient responses, we learn how life reorganizes after disruption, how migration, resource redistribution, and social cohesion contribute to survival. The past becomes a mirror, reflecting both vulnerability and resilience. These historical echoes also influence scientific understanding. Geologists, climatologists, and archaeologists draw upon the evidence left by glacial floods to reconstruct Earth's dynamic processes. Studying sediment layers, carved channels, and submerged landscapes provides insights into hydrology, erosion, and ecological succession. Human adaptation, inferred from archaeological remains, informs theories of resilience, mobility, and cultural evolution. The floods are both object of inquiry and teacher, offering lessons across disciplines. Emotionally, the echoes of these events resonate with awe. The sheer scale of water released, the suddenness of landscape transformation, and the persistence of traces over millennia evoke a sense of wonder and respect. Standing in a valley carved by ancient floods, or observing a boulder move miles from its origin, humans can sense the raw power that shaped the world long before our species attained dominance. This awareness bridges time, connecting us to events that occurred thousands of years ago, yet remain tangible in the land itself. The social implications are profound as well. Populations displaced by past floods were forced to innovate, cooperate, and adapt. Mobility, knowledge transmission, and cultural continuity were tested and strengthened. These processes contributed to human resilience and the spread of ideas and technology. Even today, understanding these patterns can inform responses to environmental disruption, emphasizing the importance of flexibility, collaboration, and attentiveness to natural systems. Ultimately, the echoes of ancient floods are multidimensional. They are physical, preserved in rock, sediment, and landform. They are ecological, shaping the distribution of species and the structure of environments. They are cultural, influencing myth, memory, and human behavior. And they are philosophical, reminding us of impermanence, vulnerability, and the delicate balance of systems far larger than ourselves. Each dimension reinforces the others, creating a holistic understanding of past change and its enduring impact. In contemplating these echoes, we are confronted with continuity and transformation. Landscapes may seem stable, civilizations may endure, but the memory embedded in the earth warns that sudden change is always possible. The floods of 11,600 years ago were dramatic, but their lessons transcend their moment. Life survives, adapts, and reshapes itself, yet it remains subject to forces beyond human control. Observing this pattern encourages humility, vigilance, and respect for the profound dynamism of the planet. The ancient floods continue to speak, their voice carried not only in sediments and channels, but in the enduring rhythms of water, life, and human memory. The world revealed itself to humanity as a place of remarkable power and unpredictability. For millennia, life had adapted to rhythms that seemed reliable. Seasonal cycles, animal migrations, and river flows. Yet the floods and the melting of vast ice sheets demonstrated that even landscapes that appear eternal can be reshaped almost overnight. The notion that Earth is stable, that rivers will follow the same course, that coastlines will remain fixed, is an illusion easily shattered by the forces inherent in the planet itself. Humanity learned, often too late, that the ground beneath their feet is not guaranteed, and that stability is always conditional. This understanding was not abstract, it was embedded in the very experience of survival. Communities that had once thrived along coastal plains, river valleys, or fertile lowlands discovered that the world could change faster than knowledge, skill, or preparation could account for. Ice that had dominated the north melted incrementally at first, then catastrophically, releasing vast quantities of water that reshaped entire regions. Rivers that had been predictable became torrents. Plains became submerged. Landmarks that had guided generations disappeared beneath rising seas. The planet revealed itself to be both nurturing and indifferent, generous in resources yet unforgiving when thresholds were crossed. The unpredictability of the Earth shaped human behavior in profound ways. Societies developed caution as a survival strategy, paying close attention to environmental cues, learning to read subtle changes in river flows, vegetation, and weather. Even seemingly minor anomalies, earlier thaws, unusual rainfall, or receding ice, could signal far-reaching consequences. Humans became attentive students of their world, understanding that adaptation required constant vigilance. Knowledge was no longer static. It needed to be updated continuously as the landscape itself evolved. At the same time, the planet's capacity for sudden change revealed the fragility of human plans and assumptions. Storage of food, careful settlement, or preparation for seasonal variation could be rendered meaningless by events beyond prediction. The memory of catastrophes like floods, landslides, or rapid sea level rise informed culture, ritual, and social structure. Communities that internalized these lessons survived better than those that ignored them. In this sense, unpredictability was not simply a threat. It was a teacher, forcing humans to recognize limits, embrace flexibility, and develop resilience. Geologically, Earth's dynamic nature was evident in multiple dimensions. Ice sheets, once immense and seemingly immovable, could disintegrate, reshaping topography. Glacial lakes, held back by ice or sediment dams, could release their water with extraordinary suddenness, carving valleys and scablands in days. By observing past events and their consequences, humans learned to anticipate not just immediate hazards, but the latent potential for transformation inherent in landscapes. This understanding influenced decision-making about settlement, resource use, and mobility, even if the exact outcomes could never be predicted. The unpredictability of the planet also influenced the relationship between humans and risk. In regions prone to flooding or rapid environmental change, strategies became more cautious and redundant. Groups maintained access to multiple water sources, diversified food sources, and planned for mobility in the face of sudden loss. Knowledge transmission became critical, ensuring that awareness of danger persisted even as generations passed. The environment dictated a level of humility, reinforcing the principle that survival required both observation and respect. Even as stability returned to many regions after the chaos of floods and ice retreat, the memory of unpredictability lingered. Valleys carved by torrents remained oversized relative to modern rivers, serving as constant reminders of past force. Coastal terraces, sediment deposits, and glacial moraines marked the scale and speed of prior change. Humans, navigating these altered landscapes, could not ignore these reminders. The lessons of unpredictability were written into the earth itself, in forms that transcended language or culture. From a broader perspective, these dynamics reveal that planetary change is rarely gradual in a human sense. Long periods of apparent stability can be punctuated by sudden, profound events. The consequences of threshold crossing are disproportionately large relative to the incremental changes that precede them. Understanding this pattern is essential not just for interpreting the past, but for anticipating future possibilities. Life continues within bounds defined by the capacity for rapid transformation. The philosophical implications are profound. Humans are not separate from the forces that shape the planet. The assumption of control is fragile. Respect for natural limits, attentiveness to environmental signals, and adaptability are not optional. They are essential for survival. Earth is a system of interlinked processes where ice, water, land, and atmosphere interact with complexity and indifference to individual intentions. Recognizing this is a form of wisdom born from experience, observation, and memory. Modern parallels reinforce the relevance of these lessons. Climate change, glacial retreat, and extreme weather events remind us that the forces that reshaped the world 11,600 years ago continue to operate. The capacity for sudden environmental transformation remains. Studying past events provides insight into potential outcomes, resilient strategies, and the importance of observation and adaptation. Humanity's ongoing challenge is to respect the scale and speed of these processes, integrating knowledge of unpredictability into practical and cultural frameworks. In the end, the planet's capacity to change overnight is both a threat and a lesson. It underscores the impermanence of landscapes, the fragility of human planning, and the necessity of adaptability. It reveals the interconnectedness of systems, how ice sheets, rivers, seas, and ecosystems respond collectively to shifts in energy, temperature, and mass. Recognizing this unpredictability is not despair. It is preparation, awareness, and humility. It is a reminder that life endures not because it controls the earth, but because it responds intelligently, attentively, and resiliently to its ever-changing forces. The ice ages end, and the floods that followed are enduring proof that the planet is capable of rapid, transformative action, and that survival depends on understanding, respecting, and adapting to that reality. The floods and ice melts of 11,600 years ago were more than geological events. They were mirrors reflecting the essence of human existence in a world that could change without warning. Beyond the immediate struggle for survival, these cataclysmic transformations reveal fundamental truths about human resilience, vulnerability, and the capacity for reflection. To study these events is not merely to reconstruct rivers, lakes, and coastlines. It is to explore how humans perceive and respond to forces that dwarf their individual power, and to consider what that response says about the human condition itself. One of the most striking lessons lies in vulnerability. Humans, like all living beings, are subject to the limits imposed by the natural world. The floods did not discriminate. They reshaped land indiscriminately, destroying fertile plains, displacing animal populations, and scattering human groups. Entire regions were submerged, leaving no trace for those who had called them home. Survival depended on awareness, mobility, and adaptation, but even the most careful strategies could be overwhelmed. This vulnerability is a persistent reality. Despite ingenuity, humans remain part of a larger system governed by laws of physics, climate, and ecology. Recognizing this fundamental fragility is essential to understanding the depth of human experience during periods of rapid environmental change. Resilience, however, is equally evident. In the face of these transformations, humans adapted. They relocated, reorganized social structures, and modified their subsistence strategies. Where rivers had changed course and fertile plains had been lost, communities found alternative routes, new resources, and safer grounds. Tools were adapted to new conditions, settlement patterns evolved, and knowledge was transmitted across generations. Resilience is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to respond to it effectively. These events highlight the interplay between fragility and endurance, showing that human survival is a dynamic process, negotiated continually with the environment. Memory plays a central role in this narrative. Catastrophic events imprint themselves on culture, not just physically but emotionally and cognitively. Oral traditions preserve stories of floods, disappearing lands, and survival strategies. These narratives were more than myth. They were functional knowledge, encoding information about risk, timing, and geography. Memory allowed humans to anticipate potential hazards, to transmit lessons learned from previous generations, and to maintain cultural continuity despite disruption. The floods demonstrated that survival depends not just on immediate action, but on the ability to integrate experience into communal understanding and long-term planning. Adaptation also had a spatial dimension. Humans were forced to reconsider their relationship to the landscape. Places once assumed safe became dangerous, while previously marginal areas offered new opportunities. The dynamic interaction between humans and their environment fostered a profound understanding of local ecologies. Knowledge of animal behavior, plant cycles, river patterns, and seasonal variations became indispensable. Humans learned to read subtle signs, to anticipate change, and to act preemptively. This adaptive intelligence is a hallmark of human survival, revealing the capacity to integrate observation, memory, and action in ways that transcend immediate necessity. The floods also reshaped human perception of time. Before these events, stability may have suggested that the future could be reliably predicted from past experience. Catastrophic change shattered that assumption. Humans were confronted with evidence that landscapes, climates, and ecosystems could be transformed far faster than individual lifetimes. This realization altered expectations, encouraging a mindset that balanced foresight with flexibility. It fostered cultural mechanisms to prepare for uncertainty, from seasonal mobility to the creation of myths encoding cautionary lessons. Emotionally, these transformations were profound. Grief, fear, awe, and wonder intertwined as humans encountered forces beyond comprehension. Emotional experience became a guide, teaching caution and respect. Survival was not just a physical endeavor, but an emotional one, demanding the regulation of fear, the mobilization of courage, and the ability to act under stress. The intensity of these experiences shaped cultural identity, reinforcing communal bonds and shared understanding. Human response to catastrophe is therefore both practical and deeply emotional, reflecting a holistic engagement with the world. Philosophically, the floods invite reflection on the relationship between humans and nature. The events underscore that humans are participants in ecological and geological processes, not masters of them. The sudden release of glacial waters and the subsequent transformation of landscapes illustrate that power does not reside solely in human hands. Recognition of this reality cultivates humility, emphasizing that human agency is always bounded by larger forces, yet the ability to respond, adapt, and endure demonstrates the distinctiveness of human intelligence and culture. Humans navigate these limits creatively, negotiating a path between vulnerability and agency. The events also raise questions about continuity and change. Landscapes, ecosystems, and human cultures were all profoundly altered, yet life persisted. Species migrated, ecosystems re-established themselves, and human knowledge evolved to accommodate new conditions. This balance between loss and renewal is central to understanding the human condition. Survival is neither static nor guaranteed, but contingent upon adaptability and learning. The floods exemplify the tension between disruption and continuity, showing how catastrophe can serve as both destructive force and catalyst for innovation. Humans' encounter with such transformative events also highlights the importance of perspective. From a short-term viewpoint, survival is immediate, focused on day-to-day necessities. From a long-term perspective, patterns emerge, revealing cycles, thresholds, and consequences that are invisible within a single lifetime. Floods demonstrate that understanding emerges not only from direct experience but from integrating events over time, across generations. This capacity for longitudinal awareness is a defining feature of human cognition and culture. Moreover, these events illuminate the ethical dimensions of survival. Decisions made in response to floods and environmental upheaval affected not only individual survival, but community well-being. Cooperation, sharing of knowledge, and coordinated action were essential. In this way, catastrophe shaped social norms, reinforcing behaviors that enhance group resilience. The floods, therefore, were not only natural events, but social catalysts, influencing human relationships, culture, and moral frameworks. Finally, the floods teach that human existence is inseparable from planetary processes. The world that emerged after the ice melt and the Great Floods was not simply a backdrop, it was an active participant in human life, shaping possibilities and constraints. Humans, in turn, responded, leaving traces of adaptation, culture, and memory. The dialogue between humans and the Earth is continuous, a dynamic exchange in which both forces, natural and human, coexist, interact, and influence each other. Understanding this interplay offers profound insights into the human condition. Our capacity to endure, adapt, and reflect in the face of forces far greater than ourselves is central to what it means to be human. The floods thus serve as both historical and philosophical mirrors. They reveal the fragility and resilience of life, the importance of memory and adaptation, and the inescapable reality of uncertainty. They show that survival is not passive but active, demanding observation, cooperation, and creativity. They teach that life persists not through control, but through attentiveness to change and willingness to respond. In contemplating these events, humans gain not only knowledge of past landscapes and climates, but also insight into enduring truths about existence. Vulnerability, adaptation, continuity, and the capacity to endure in a world that can transform overnight. Standing on the shores of deep time, humans are confronted not only with the scale of geological processes, but with their own fleeting place within them. The floods, the melting ice, the rising seas, these events unfolded on temporal scales that dwarf individual lifetimes, stretching across generations, centuries, and millennia. From this vantage, it becomes possible to see the Earth not as a static backdrop for human activity, but as an active, dynamic system shaped by forces of immense power and subtle interconnection. The landscape that appears permanent today is in reality a stage upon which countless cycles of change have played out and will continue to play out long after individual humans have passed. The sense of awe that emerges from contemplating this deep time is profound. Rivers that now meander gently once roared with energy, carrying massive boulders, reshaping valleys, and scouring plains in a matter of days. Coastal plains that seem stable now were once submerged beneath surging seas, altering ecosystems and dispersing human populations. Mountains, valleys, and plains bear the scars of processes that unfolded over tens of thousands of years, revealing the incredible capacity of the Earth to transform itself. These features, etched into the planet, provide tangible evidence of forces that are both ancient and ongoing, grounding abstract concepts of time in visible, physical reality. Humans, in turn, are revealed as remarkably small actors within this vast system, yet paradoxically capable of adaptation and resilience that allows them to persist across these transformations. Survival depended on attentiveness to the environment, the ability to read subtle signals, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Seasonal patterns, animal migrations, and environmental cues informed movement and decision-making, while memory, both cultural and emotional, preserved lessons of past catastrophe. In this way, human existence is both fragile and enduring, tethered to the rhythms of the planet, yet capable of navigating them with intelligence and foresight. The experience of standing within this perspective encourages reflection on the interconnectedness of events. The sudden release of glacial waters did not merely reshape a single valley. It influenced river systems, ecosystems, and human settlement patterns across continents. Rising seas altered coastlines, fragmenting populations and redistributing resources. These physical changes had cascading effects on human culture, migration, and social structure. Understanding these connections illuminates the complex feedbacks between environment and human activity, highlighting the sensitivity of human societies to shifts in the natural world. Emotionally, the perspective of deep time invites humility. The scale and power of natural processes dwarf individual and even collective human action. Entire landscapes can be erased, and human efforts, no matter how diligent, are subject to forces beyond control. Yet within this recognition of vulnerability lies an appreciation for resilience. Humanity persists not through domination of the earth, but through attentiveness, cooperation, and adaptation. This duality, smallness in scale yet capacity for endurance, defines much of the human experience in relation to deep time. Philosophically, contemplating these shores prompts questions about permanence and impermanence. The landscapes we inhabit today are transient, temporary states in a continuum of change. Ice advances and retreats, rivers shift courses, seas rise and fall. Humans, who often assume permanence in settlements, institutions, and social structures, are reminded that continuity is contingent. This perspective encourages flexibility in thought and action, promoting strategies that embrace uncertainty while leveraging opportunity. To survive within deep time is to recognize that adaptation is not a temporary measure, but a continual necessity. The floods and ice melts also illuminate the processes by which memory and knowledge are embedded in culture. Oral traditions, myths, and stories captured experiences that could not be fully comprehended in real time. These narratives preserved lessons about the power of water, the risks of certain landscapes, and strategies for survival, ensuring that knowledge endured across generations. The land itself acted as a teacher, providing cues about resource availability, safe passage, and environmental hazards. Humans learned to read these signs, integrating observation, memory, and action into a coherent approach to life in a volatile world. From a scientific perspective, the shores of deep time offer insight into the dynamics of Earth systems. Sediment layers, river channels, and coastal formations record episodes of sudden change, illustrating principles of hydrology, erosion, and climate interaction. Glacial deposits, moraines, and ice cores preserve evidence of environmental stress, offering quantitative data on rates of change, temperatures, and water volumes. The Earth remembers events, preserves evidence, and reshapes itself. Humans too preserve memory, learn from experience, and navigate change. Together, this dynamic forms the enduring dialogue of life within the vast continuum of planetary processes. In this view, the past floods, the melting ice, and the rising seas are more than history. They are teachers. They show that while humans cannot control the Earth, they can interpret its signals, adapt to its rhythms, and survive within its vastness. Deep time invites reflection on scale, vulnerability, and endurance, offering a perspective that situates human existence within an ongoing story of transformation. Observing the present through this lens, humans gain not only historical insight, but also philosophical and practical guidance. The world is ever-changing, yet life persists, shaped by attentiveness, resilience, and the ability to respond wisely to forces beyond immediate comprehension. The culmination of these extraordinary events, the melting of ice sheets, the catastrophic floods, and the gradual stabilization of the planet's climate, marks not merely the end of a geological chapter, but the dawn of a new era in which humanity began to inhabit a world shaped by both memory and transformation. The landscapes that emerged after this period were profoundly different from those that had preceded them, yet they bore the traces of immense forces that had acted invisibly and violently, reshaping continents, carving rivers, and redefining coastlines. These marks, etched into stone, sediment, and watercourses, serve as a permanent record of change, a reminder that the Earth's surface is neither static nor immune to the effects of natural upheaval. For humans, living in the aftermath of such events required not only survival skills, but also the capacity for reflection, adaptation, and the integration of experience into cultural knowledge. The physical world itself was both a challenge and a teacher. River valleys, sculpted by torrents of water, became guides and hazards at the same time. Some channels were so large that ordinary rivers now appear almost insignificant within their bounds, hinting at the scale of past catastrophes. Submerged plains and newly formed wetlands offered resources, yet they also required new strategies to navigate safely. Humans had to learn to interpret these environments, discerning where water would stabilize, where sediment would be fertile, and where ice and water could become sudden threats once more. The ability to read the land was no longer optional, it became central to existence, linking perception to action, memory to strategy, and observation to survival. This period also catalyzed profound social and cultural evolution. Humans, previously accustomed to near constant mobility, began to experiment with longer-term settlements in places that offered reliable resources. These sites, often near rivers, lakes, or fertile plains, became hubs of repeated habitation, allowing knowledge to accumulate in ways that transient camps could not support. Skills such as tool-making, fishing, plant gathering, and water navigation were refined over generations. Patterns of cooperation and knowledge sharing solidified, shaping the social fabric of early communities. Settlements became laboratories of human adaptation, where experimentation and experience converged to produce cultural innovation. Memory, both individual and collective, played a crucial role in guiding human responses to the transformed environment. Stories of floods, shifting rivers, and lost lands were preserved and transmitted orally, encoding practical lessons alongside emotional truths. Myths and legends, while symbolic, retained fragments of lived experience, warning future generations about the potential for sudden environmental change. These narratives provided a framework for interpreting natural phenomena, ensuring that knowledge survived even as the landscapes themselves continued to evolve. They illustrate the intimate relationship between memory, culture, and survival, showing that human intelligence extends beyond immediate perception to encompass the temporal breadth of generations. The environmental shifts also demanded new forms of technological innovation. Watercraft and fishing implements became increasingly sophisticated, enabling humans to exploit aquatic resources effectively. Tools and storage methods were refined to accommodate changing conditions, allowing communities to buffer against variability in food availability. These innovations reflect a deepening understanding of the dynamic interplay between humans and their environment, a recognition that adaptation must be proactive as well as reactive. Each technological advance, no matter how small, contributed to resilience, enhancing the ability of human societies to persist within an ever-changing world. The psychological landscape was equally transformed. Humans who lived through these events carried a heightened awareness of vulnerability, tempered by resilience. The suddenness of environmental change reinforced caution, attentiveness, and flexibility. At the same time, The successful navigation of floods, ice retreats, and rising seas instilled confidence in the capacity to endure and adapt. This combination of humility and empowerment became embedded in cultural practices, informing both daily decision-making and long-term planning. Emotional experience was inseparable from survival strategy, shaping behavior, belief, and social cohesion. Ecologically, the post-flood world exhibited both continuity and innovation. New wetlands, rivers, and fertile plains emerged, supporting diverse plant and animal populations. Ecosystems reorganized rapidly in response to the transformed landscapes, creating new niches and opportunities for humans and other species alike. Humans learned to anticipate animal movements, exploit plant cycles, and interact with these reconstituted environments, integrating their activities into broader ecological patterns. This integration underscores the deep interdependence of human and environmental systems, illustrating that survival was contingent not solely on ingenuity, but on responsiveness to ecological signals. Coastal regions, transformed by rising seas, became focal points of both risk and opportunity. Submerged lands severed old connections between human populations, while newly formed estuaries and bays created environments rich in resources. These dynamic interfaces between land and water encouraged experimentation with maritime mobility, fishing, and foraging, reinforcing the importance of attentiveness to tides, currents, and seasonal changes. Humans developed knowledge systems that combined observation, memory, and shared experience, enabling them to navigate a world in which the boundary between land and sea was constantly in flux. The philosophical implications of this era are profound. Humans came to recognize that permanence is an illusion, and that both opportunity and danger are inherent in the natural world. Stability, when it occurs, is temporary, contingent upon forces far beyond human control.